welcome to the darker side of boxing, season 3, episode number 8. This is all about Old Smoke John Morrissey, a tale from many years ago. We're going way back, even before the 1900s. We're going all the way back to the 1800s for this particular story, and it's a story that will make you feel like you've stepped onto the set of Gangs of New York. That film with Leonardo DiCaprio, yes, that is the one that was turned into a meme eventually. It is this particular era of time that we are looking to cover with John Morrissey. He was a man that was indicted for murder. He was a man that went on to become a very well-known politician of his time. But there's so many stories surrounding John Morrissey and his origins and everything that he went through in life. It certainly fits into this narrative of the darker side of boxing, and it's certainly against everything that we've probably done for the darker side of boxing.
Yeah, it's definitely the oldest one we've ever done in anything we've ever done, whether it be legendary nights, career profile, or darker side of boxing. But it's a fascinating tale, and as you say, Sean, it is like stepping onto a movie set of Gangs of New York. It's from that era, so it gets a little bit historical in moments, but it's a bit of an education as well around this time. It definitely taught us a lot when we're running through the story of John Morrissey, the Old Smoke, and how his name come about, and everything else he gets up to in this whole tale. But yeah, sit back, enjoy, and maybe after you might even want to go and watch Gangs of New York, because I know I did.
Now, it all began for John Morrissey on February the 12th, 1831, and he was born in Templemore County, Tipperary in Ireland. And he was actually born during a very difficult period for thousands of Irish who lived under a cruel and inhumane British ruling. Ireland was part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland from 1801 right up until 1922. John Morrissey had a line of ancestors who would have starved, stolen and hated all things English since the Revolution of 1688. They would have fought during the Irish Rebellion of 1798, took part in the sporadic violence that continued in County Wicklow, and followed the public speaker, rebel leader and Irish Republican Robert Emmet when he attempted to overthrow the British Crown in Ireland. The Morrissey family fought for their freedom and wanted nothing more than the right to live and survive. They passed on their hardness, strength and intolerance to John. By the time he was brought into this world, the country had fallen into a state of disrepair. His mother Mary had lived in poverty all her life, and as a young mother, life hadn't really got much better. Famine stalked the beautiful landscape of Ireland, and in its wake came the typhoid fever, which was common in places with poor hygiene. Even the basics, like safe drinking water, it killed peasants by the thousands. Even the most optimistic of Irishmen had given up hope that one day their land would be free, and Mary was one of many who dreamed of a better life. To escape poverty, she identified the promised land of America. Now, author Jack Coford wrote the book Brandy for Heroes, a biography of the Honourable John Morrissey, champion heavyweight of America and state senator. He explained their circumstances and the living conditions, and he wrote, "Taxes for insolent English officials, taxes for the fat bishop, potatoes and salt to eat, with meat once a month if you were lucky, boiled wild weeds if you were not, a filthy cabin to sleep in, men and women barefoot and half-clothed, summer and winter."
Well, conditions were so poor that Mary worked hard to make her dreams a reality, and she began to save the little money they earned by selling pigs, sticks of furniture, and sacks of potatoes. It wasn't much, but it was that little bit of hope that got her through the days, weeks, and months as she built the foundation of a new life in America. Her husband and John's father, Timothy, was a decent man who loved his wife, but he also loved a drink or three. He wasn't sold on the idea of moving to America. All he ever knew were the hills of Ireland, and however, she did eventually convince him that America was the best option for them and baby John. Now, although the Great Famine was over 10 years away, emigration from Ireland was already underway. The day finally came for the Morrisseys in the summer of 1832, when the small family stood on the Belfast Quay waiting to board an immigrant ship. The young family would have heard of the American letter, which played an important role in the encouragement of Irish immigrants. It played its part in changing the Irish attitude on immigration from one of resignation to one of acceptance and even anticipation. However, the grass isn't always greener, and as described in the Mayo County Library, the journey to America consisted of 3 phases, each bringing its own difficulties. First of all, there was the choice of port to depart from, initially Irish and later English ports, especially Liverpool. There then was the actual crossing itself, which was often very traumatic, so much so that the phrase coffin ship had become part of the vocabulary of the history of the famine. Finally, there was the arrival in America, where immigrants were faced with the problems of finding a shelter and eventually employment, and generally adapting to life in a new country.
The Morrisseys boarded their ship from the Belfast port and must have been shocked by its surroundings. Using the Mayo County Library's descriptions, conditions on the crossing were appalling. Deck passengers had lower priority than livestock or baggage, and up to 2,000 could be crowded onto an open deck in all weathers, clinging to each other to avoid being washed overboard. Prices ranged from £4 to £10 per person. The immigrants usually arrived at the dock cold, poor, starving and often sick. The lodging houses were often little more than filthy, overcrowded slums. Hundreds of immigrants would be crammed into dens with men, women and children all bedded down together, often on a cold floor without blankets. Immigrants could be robbed, cheated and also ran the risk of contracting a variety of contagious diseases. They were subject to racketeers and agents for the shipping companies. Among the most common scams was the selling of dollars at extortionate rates, selling poor quality clothes and overcharging for boarding. A more sophisticated fraud was to sell American land to immigrants, land which was worthless or which the seller didn't even own. It was also known for immigrants to be offered hiding places on ships, such as in boxes for a small fee. Again, we refer to the author Jack Coford, who explained the Morrissey's journey and said the ship was a taste of hell that had not entered into Mary's calculations. They slept in a breathless, stifling hold that stank of human filth. They ate rotten potatoes and scummy salt pork, and their stomachs resisted from bad food and seasickness. The sailors sought to seduce country girls, and some of the girls were willing, and half a dozen of them became pregnant before the voyage was even over. Tim engaged in several fights because Mary had fine, firm breasts and was wanted by every man on board. Good old Tim, giving a good scrap to everybody. That was after his missus with her firm, fine breasts.
Jack Cofield, love that, firm, fine breasts. Carried on with what Jack Cofield said. What he wrote, he said, morning after morning, she, as in Mary, rose and went on deck to find herself still in the vast blue bowl of the sea, and hungered for the hills she had known, and wept for the evils they might still have to face. Days turned into terrible weeks, and weeks stretched themselves into almost an impossible month, before a green shoreline etched itself across the edge of the ocean. Hell had its end. Thank God. Thank goodness. Well, Mary, Tim and baby John, well, they survived the voyage to New York, but there was no doubt they suffered scars mentally and physically from it. Mary was adamant that this would be the country where little John would thrive, something he would have been denied in Ireland. When they arrived in Manhattan, they realised quickly that the Irish were unwelcome. So they followed their own, the Templemore people, and arrived in Troy, a New York state. However, they found the city disappointing. They lived in poverty, just like in Ireland. The only improvement was no shrieking pigs. This was not what Mary had dreamed of. But there was work and no English tax collectors. Tim began work as a labourer for $1 and 6 drinks of whiskey a day. Now, that whiskey must have made him frisky, because they went on to have 6 more children, and all of them were girls. To give you some more context to what life was like in Troy, we'll use an article written on January the 4th, 2021 by John Warren. And he wrote, although there had been Irish immigrants to the colonies of the Americas in the 1830s, the pace of immigration of unskilled Irish quickened in the United States. These new immigrants strained community governments and brought criticism from native-born Americans against what they perceived as a flood of Irish or poor Irish people and a corresponding rise of criminality. Where once American patriots had denounced the restriction of immigration to America in the Declaration of Independence, policies in Europe to foster the immigration of poor people was seen not only as a threat to American prosperity, but a threat to the Roman Catholic takeover. So it's very religious, and this is going to be a major talking point throughout the whole episode, as in what John Morrissey becomes.
It became a bitter war between the Irish Catholics and the American Protestants, who were already enjoying their status as America's unofficial state religion. Many American Protestants believed Catholics were under the control of a foreign Pope King, and hostile to the elected American values that protected the country's recently won independence. They said they were uneducated and unqualified to vote and susceptible to exploitation by corrupt politicians. In Troy, nativists hung Irish effigies around the city each St. Patrick's Day to remind the newly arriving Irish where they stood in society. This actually led to the St. Patrick's Day riots in 1837, which John Morrissey would have witnessed and felt the brutality of at the age of just 6. Now, John grew up to be a big strong kid with an even stronger will and a very quick temper, pretty perfect for the society he was growing up in. Just before he was a teenager, there was a heavy Irish vote in Troy, which led to a small revolution. John learnt quickly that if you wanted something, you just had to go and take it. He stole fruit or meat when he could, meaning on several occasions he got his collar felt by the law. They would rough him up and throw him in a police cell. Nothing really ever came of those arrests. It was just a little bit of a beating, and we'll throw you in the cell, and then that's it, off on your bop. His father Tim had become popular among his friends and voted the right way, so a politician would always come to John's rescue. The young Morrissey didn't spend much time in any formal schooling. Compulsory education had not yet been written into law, and child labour was not frowned upon. The family were in desperate need of money, so at the age of 12, John went to work in Orr's wallpaper factory. He worked 60 hours a week for $2 and did as much labour as a man. However, he disliked it immensely.
He did, and soon he swapped factory work for the local Burden steel mill, where he worked for a year, earning $5 a week now. So he's gone up in the world, before moving on again, this time to Johnson Cox and Co stove factory in 1846, and he started earning $9 a week. He was a quick learner and wanted to obviously earn money quickly. Now, while working at the steel mills and grafting in the factory, John Morrissey built a reputation for being able to handle himself. He was often involved in a fight with many of the short-tempered workers and discovered that he was not only good at it, as in fighting, but he actually enjoyed a good scuff as well. Now, he stood at 6 foot tall and was full of muscle, so it was no surprise that he was a lot stronger and faster than the older men he had a scrap with. Now, by the age of 17, John had a reputation as one of the most prominent rounders, which was an American slang for someone who sorts out troublemakers in saloons or other establishments. Now, the Chicago Tribune, they explained, and they said there were at the time 2 parties among the youth roughs and rowdies of Troy, known as Uptown and Downtown. Young as he was, Morrissey was the leader, or as he used to express it, the chief devil of the Downtown party. John O'Rourke and John McKay, aged 24 and 26 respectively, were the leaders of the Uptown gang. Now, the quarrels and fights between these two gangs were insistent and very annoying to those respected citizens of Troy. The article continued to explain that in the fall of 1848, John Morrissey accidentally encountered O'Rourke in the square at the lower end of 4th Street. O'Rourke was partially intoxicated and in a quarrelsome frame of mind, and without provocation, he started on John Morrissey. They immediately clinched for a fight, but O'Rourke, his companions, knowing he was pissed as a fart and wouldn't be able to fight back, he would probably get badly beaten up, so they separated them.
A few days afterward, the two again accidentally met in Lawrence's saloon in River Street. Both had their respective gangs with them. A fight ensued between the two, and O'Rourke was soundly thrashed. John Morrissey was the hero of the hour in the lower quarters of Troy. O'Rourke and his gang were not content with the outcome, so Morrissey had to fight all of O'Rourke's chosen comrades, one after the other. There were 8 fights, and all were fought during the year. Morrissey was a triumphant victor in all, and though only 18 years of age, his name and achievements were the discussion among sporting circles in every state. One of Troy's most notorious gentlemen in the year of 1848 was Alexander Hamilton. He owned the Hamilton Saloon, which many men from the steel mills, river and factories attended at night after grafting long hours in the day. Hamilton wasn't just a saloon owner, he was also a pimp who hosted a corridor of women he also owned. Many young women that arrived in Troy were seduced and naively coerced into prostitution. After these women had exhausted all possibilities, they would eventually succumb to working for Hamilton because he paid them well. He was recognised by the police of Troy as one of their most valuable patrons. Their only complaint was the rowdiness of his house, of the pissed up men who often caused trouble. To keep the peace in such a troublesome place was not easy, so Hamilton hired bouncers from the riverfront. He offered them good pay, free liquor, meals, and the run of the bedrooms. None stayed for long in spite of these benefits because it was too dangerous. The pay just wasn't worth more than their life. So in need of a man who could restore order in his disorderly saloon, he needed the hardest fighting man in Troy.
Well, as anyone would, he began his search in the best place possible, and that was all around the bars and townhouses around town. And the same name kept popping up. This name wasn't a man, but it was a teenager. It was John Morrissey. And he sent a representative to summon John with a job offer. And after a couple of days, he surfaced. When they finally met, Hamilton asked, "You're still working in Cox's stove factory, ain't you?" "Yes," replied John. Hamilton asked if he liked it. John's response was short and sweet, "No." "How much do you make?" "Is that any of your business?" he replied. Hamilton shrugged his shoulders. "Maybe. I need a bouncer. Maybe I can pay you more than you're getting." Morrissey replied, "If you want me working here, you'll give me $20 a week." Now Hamilton hesitated. "Well, I might pay you that if I was sure you could do all the things they say you can." And Morrissey, well, he smiled. "You want me to prove it? All right. Bibber McGeehan is at a bar. Will he do as a sample?" McGeehan now, he was a notable character on the Albany docks. He had actually apparently gouged out several eyes and bitten off the noses of some unfortunate soul, a few of them. Now, none of Mr. Hamilton's previous bouncers had even attempted to tackle him. And Hamilton was pleased. He actually said, "You couldn't have picked better." So together they walked to the bar where Bibber was pouring himself a drink. He looked up, he saw Morrissey, obviously he knew he had a reputation. He set his glass on the bar and he said, "Oh, it's you, is it?" Well, John didn't even answer. He walked straight towards McGeehan and whacked him in the jaw. Bibber's eyes glazed over, his knees buckled under him and he collapsed, and his big head bounced off a brass rail. Morrissey lifted him up, Hamilton pushed open the swinging doors, John threw Bibber out onto the street, and Hamilton accepted this demonstration with the utmost approval and said happily, 20 it is.
Within no time, John Morrissey had order among a disorderly business. He witnessed men get beaten the shit out of and others get kicked to death while working, yet it didn't faze him. In fact, he enjoyed the thrill of it. He was now earning decent money, sorting out the unruly patrons, and even taught himself how to read and write while working at the brothel. The young ladies liked John, but he was never interested, even though he could have had his pick of all the working girls. Within 6 months, he began to feel dissatisfied with where his life was going. He never wanted to stay in one place for too long. He was desperate to travel, so he applied for work with Captain Levi Smith on a boat called the City of Troy. He was assigned a boring job of being deckhand, which is basically cleaning the top deck and learning from the able seamen on the merchant ship. When he informed Hamilton of his next adventure, Hamilton of course was gutted to lose him. He was desperate to keep his young bouncer, so he offered him $25 and then $30 a week, but Morrissey's mind was made up and he refused. Being able to travel in his new job was not the only thing he enjoyed. He had also taken a liking to Captain Smith's 15-year-old daughter Susie. Now John enjoyed working on the City of Troy. He loved the freedom, taking in the sights of the landscape and of the beautiful Susie. In between working as a deckhand and courting Susie, John fought many bare-knuckle fights in barrooms and on the gambling riverboats. Although boxing was forbidden in America, there was tremendous interest in the big fights. Tom Hyer had won the American Championship in 1816 by defeating Country McCloskey in 101 rounds on the Palisades.
So a young and up-and-coming prize fighter called James Yankee Sullivan was in McCloskey's corner that day, and he jumped into the ring and he challenged the winner. Several months later, a meeting took place at 28 Park Road between the prize fighters' promoters who agreed the conditions. The up-and-coming fight generated a lot of interest, and it wasn't long before Alexander Hamilton, a keen fight enthusiast, heard about it. Now, he organised the long trip to Paul Island, where he could witness the championship battle at first hand. Tom Hyer kept hold of his title that day, beating Yankee Sullivan into submission after just 17 minutes. Now, on the way back from Paul Island, Hamilton stopped in New York at the America's Club on 28 Row Park, which was owned by Captain Isaiah Rinders. Now, he was actually a knife fighter, which is, you had bare-knuckle fighters, you had knife fighters back then. Now, he worked for Tammany Hall, Democratic Party, and his job was to arrange general chaos and ballot box stuffing to ensure victory for a very corrupt candidate. Rinders had surrounded himself with a collection of murderous gentlemen who called themselves the Bowery Boys. They would become associated with the Native Americans, a political party who supported the Wing. They were a nativist, anti-Catholic, and an anti-Irish criminal gang, based, of course, in the Bury neighborhood, hence the name, of Manhattan, New York. And the violent street gang were described by a storyteller who was Herbert Ainsbury as the most ferocious rough and tumble fighters that ever cracked a skull or gorged out an eyeball. You had Rinders, you had Tom Hyer, you had William, Butcher Bill Paul, Big Tom Burns, Dutch Charlie Dwayne, One Eye Daly, and there were other unsavoury scallywags that were also drinking and blowing smoke up each other's asses after this fight. And obviously Hamilton, he joined the party, and he was unable to resist Hamilton to begin talk of John Morrissey. So he's dropping his name there. And what he says is, there's this lad. With all respect to you, gentlemen, he is the greatest fighter in the world. Unless you have seen for yourself, you would scarcely credit it.
They all burst out laughing, and Dutch Charlie reacted. There ain't a man in the place who couldn't murder that farmer of yours. Just send him down and I will agree to bite off his ears. Sometime after, John arrived back in Troy from his ventures on the river and popped in to see his old boss Hamilton, who disclosed his meeting with the Bowery Boys. He informed Morrissey of what Dutch Charlie said about him, which enraged John, and he announced, "I've been waiting to go to New York for a long time. Now I've got a good excuse. I'll drop in on Dutch Charlie and have a word with him." Hamilton had lit a fire up Morrissey's arse by shit-stirring, but he told John, "They are bad people," to which John replied, "The worse, the better. I'll go to the city on my next trip and stop off this time, maybe for quite a spell." John was looking to establish himself further afield, and opportunity knocked in the symbol of Dutch Charlie. It meant that he had to leave his new love behind, but she understood and would wait for his return. 2 days later, John arrived in Manhattan and walked into the America's Club on 28 Park Row. It was packed to the rafters, but he never felt intimidated. John Morrissey had some enormous bollocks indeed. And the moment arrived, and he asked Captain Rinders, "Is Dutch Charlie here?" He replied, "No, Lady Suffolk is trotting today, and Charlie went to see her." "Who are you?" At that point, Bill the Butcher Poole, who was a deadly knife fighter and officially the toughest brawler in New York, burst into laughter. He knew who John was and said, "I'll bet it's the farmer from Troy. It can't be anybody but the farmer from Troy."
So standing only feet away, John replied, "Yes, I'm from Troy. And you? I don't know your name, mister, but you look like your mother would be a dollar street walker." So he's basically calling her a prostitute. Unaware of who he was or who he was talking to, John had just called the deadliest knife fighter his mother a whore. And naively, for that insult, John just expected a fair fight. But while he screwed the butcher from only a few feet away, he was hit from behind. He staggered under the impact of the blow, but never fell from the blow. He fought valiantly, throwing punches from all directions and scrapping it out while heavily outnumbered. The attack was completely unexpected and vicious. He knew that if he collapsed, they would kick him to death with their metal toe cap boots, which is what they wore back then. He tried desperately to stay on his feet, but a clay pot to the back of the head sent him crashing to the floor and out cold. He's unconscious. And in an instant, a dozen men jumped on him using fists, feet, clubs, jugs, bottles, you name it, they did it. And John Morrissey, well, unconscious on the floor, he must have just seen his life flash before him. It was literally a moment where he thought he was going to be getting kicked to death and this was going to be it. He's going to be finished. But then Captain Rinders, he came to his saviour and he demanded, this is what he said apparently, "Leave him alone, leave him alone. You, Bill, and you. One eye get away, or by God, I'll use this knife on you." And the mob just continued to beat the shit out of John, who's unconscious on the floor. But then reluctantly, they backed away. Rinders stood over John, gripping his weapon, his knife. And Paul apparently said, "We ought to kill him and save Dutch Charlie the trouble." And Rinders intervened. And he said, "None of you are going to do anything to that boy. Why, you fools, we need a fighter like him." The butcher was pissed off. He said, "The goddamn Pope lover, I should have finished him in spite of you." And then Rinders protested, No. He's only a boy."
Rinders massaged the butcher's ego and said, "How will he be bothering you? You can handle him, Bill, any time you want." He had convinced the mob to step down and then praised the wounded John Morrissey and said, "Did anybody ever stand up to you fellows the way he did? Things are going to be hot in this city, my buccos, and we can find a place for the farmer." He nodded toward the bartenders for assistance. "Carry him upstairs and call a doctor." Alex Hamilton was right. There ain't a man in the world who can fight like this youngster. I'll have plenty of use for him. Because of the time, tales have differed through the years, and some sources confirm most of this story, but other sources have suggested that Morrissey actually made his boxing debut in Captain Rinders' saloon. The other version of this story mentions that John was just having a drink at the bar when he heard a request for a fight. He took off his cap and said, "I can lick any man in the place." 8 men then silently turned from their drinks, grabbed chairs, bottles and other handy utensils and rushed him. Nevertheless, no matter what story you believe, Morrissey clearly held his own until Rinders knocked him out with a jug before carefully nursing him back to full health. You can believe whichever one of those stories, but what we do know is that he was almost certainly nearly beaten to death, and then for the next 3 days was laid up in the upper room of the America's Club while a doctor medicated and stitched him up, and Rinders stood at his bedside. Rinders was always on the lookout for young men with fighting skills, and he certainly found one in John Morrissey, hence why he saved him from certain death. When he finally came round, he was thankful to Rinders, but was still filled with rage and revenge.
Well, Rinders also helped him out financially to travel back home to Troy, but asked him to return because he had a job for him. And when John got home to his mother, he explained that he would be working from now on in New York, and but he would still continue to send her half of his wages, which is what he was always doing anyway to support the family. Now, not even a second thought about the money. She begged him to stay. But he was adamant. He refused, and he did promise her that he would buy her a palace in New York City when he was rich, apparently. So this is a good time for us to set the scene for what it was like to live in New York City around 1848 when John Morrissey eventually was going to start working there. And the roughest part in the city was known as the Five Points. This neighborhood was assembled of thieves, gangsters, prostitutes, murderers, and villains. It was named because four streets. So it was Anthony, which is now called Worth, Cross, now Moscow, Orange, now Baxter, and then Little Water, which now is non-existent. And they all joined, producing five corners, or as they called it, points. Now, Mulberry was another street, and it was notorious for slum tenants. And that was just one street down from the 5 Points. This area, now the present day location in New York City, is Chinatown. It lays between Broadway and the Bowery. Now, historians Michael Kaplan and Elliot Goran, they explain in gory detail this very troubled time. And they argued that working class males encouraged gangs, brawling, and even homicide and rape, which was fueled by the New York City bars. Now, the emerging male code emphasized physical courage, defiance of authority, and class pride. So Irish and German immigrants brought European influences. Sexual harassment of women increased because women were more visible outside the home, as many worked in factories and shops, and obviously as prostitutes. Women were regarded as depersonalized objects, as they put it. Vulgar talk and gang rapes became an opportunity for male bonding. That's just what these two guys said. This is the place that John Morrissey is going to start working. Horrific. That was the society that John Morrissey would be working in when he returned to New York in 1848.
John met Rinders and began working as an immigrant runner alongside One-Eye Daly. Now, John disliked Daly and he distrusted him, but unlike his other gang members, he didn't hold a grudge. The immigrant runners assisted a gentleman who ruled the city in need of fresh voters. As immigrants came onto the docks, they were greeted by corrupt judges and given citizenship papers so they could vote on the impending elections. The field agents were placed strategically around the docks with the immigrant runners. They fought and haggled, then persuaded and robbed the poor immigrants. Fees were collected from keepers of boarding houses, saloons and brothels for directing them to their establishments. It was an unsavoury business, but a profitable one that Morrissey admired. But beating up immigrant civilians was not his area of expertise, particularly after his mother and father had arrived in America in the same way. But once they were forced to pledge their allegiance to the Tammany Party, he found them work and shelter and helped them obtain American citizenship. This was a much simpler process in those days that involved merely satisfying a single judge of the person's loyalty to the United States. The part of the job that Morrissey did like was fighting rival runners who tried to force him out. Once armed rivals attempted to drive him from a ship with belaying pins, which is a solid metal or wooden device used on sailing vessels, and a witness described Morrissey clearing the decks single-handed like a young Ajax. Morrissey was arrested several times from 1848 to 1849. His New York criminal record read, Morrissey was indicted in December 1848 at Troy for assault with intent to kill. In April 1849 he was indicted for burglary and in the same month convicted of assault and battery and sentenced to jail for 60 days.
Well, in 1877, the Ashtabula Weekly Telegraph wrote that John Morrissey, the bruiser, whose police record covers 9 indictments of assault and battery with and without the intention to kill, and 4 convictions, 2 indictments, and 1 conviction of burglary. Now, after serving his sentence, he was released, and then arrested again in 1849, this time for burglary. Now, he was a young man who had to provide for his very young, poor family. So when times were hard, he robbed a few houses. Look, he was paying half his wages back to his family. So anything else he could get, obviously, it was a helping hand. And when Morrissey was asked about his burglary charge, he explained that I was the only boy in a family of 8 and had to support the girls. He then said, I was indicted for burglary and assault and battery. The indictment for burglary was never tried. The district attorney regarded the charge as insignificant to be prosecuted, so dismissed it. So Morrissey had conquered all the other competitive runners by this point, except one, and that was headed by Big Tom McCann. Now, his missus was the young and beautiful Kate Ridley, who was a madame who owned an elegant brothel. Now, John, looking for McCann, or he went looking for McCann, and he decided to search for him in Kate Ridley's brothel one night. Now, Kate actually, when he arrived, Kate summoned one of her girls to go and collect him and bring him to her room. Now, at first, he thought this might be a trap by McCann, but it was the opposite. She actually seduced him instead. From then on, they began a short but very intense affair. Gossip of their relationship went from the working girls to the men in the bars, and obviously it wasn't long before Tom McCann found out and sought revenge. However, he never approached John. Instead, it was the 18-year-old Morrissey who found him in Sandy Lawrence shooting gallery of St. James's Hotel. And when Tom arrived, he was all smiles, but that smile was soon wiped off of his face when he spotted John Morrissey.
McCann didn't initiate anything. He was actually more stunned with the arrogance and the cheek of this little rascal. It was the youngster who made the first move when he insulted McCann in front of all of his friends, and Morrissey stated, "Men, if somebody took most of your business away and finished by stealing your girl, what would you do?" The room fell quiet before John continued to say, "I did those things to Tom McCann. I understand he's been around telling everybody what he was going to do to me. Well, here I am, waiting. What do you think he'll do?" Tom approached John until they were face to face. Not one to waste any time, Morrissey punched his rival across the face and they began to fight. William Burke wrote about this fight in John Morrissey, the original Old Smoke in the Chronicles of Old New York. And it reads, "At the commencement of the fight, McCann successfully threw Morrissey heavily. As he fell, a stove was overturned and a heap of hot coals rolled out, and Morrissey was forced onto them. McCann held him there until the smell of burning flesh filled the room. The bystanders threw water on the coals, and the gas and the steam arose in McCann's face, which choked and exhausted him. Morrissey then pounded McCann into insensibility. From that time until the day of his death, Morrissey was now known as Old Smoke." There are other slight variations to this tale. Another suggested, in agony, John's flesh began to simmer and smoke, and his friends came to his assistance, pouring cold water on the coals. Enduring the pain, John got back up to his feet, and in a blind rage, with his back still smoking, he battered McCann senseless. Now, John had successfully taken control of all the other rival immigrant runners, and Rinders, of course, would have been happy with his protege's work. But by the time John was 19, he decided to stop.
Wow, that he's back. I mean, how he's fought on there. Jesus Christ, incredible stuff. Now, although the job, obviously, that Rinders had for him had paid him well and improved his reputation as well, mind you, it was nothing more than just a step on the ladder for John. And he met an honest gambler, a guy called John Petrie, and he actually hired him as his assistant. I mean, who wouldn't want to hire John Morrissey as your assistant? And he advised John that, this is his own words, "I'm square because it pays better. The percentage is with the house, so much so that if a man keeps playing, you're bound to get all his money in the end. Why? In order to hurry the orderly procedure of nature, should you risk getting a bad reputation or have a hothead pull a pistol on you? Honesty is the best policy, my boy." Good advice. Now, for a while, John wasn't earning much, but he learned a lot about the gambling through Petrie. And he also heard a lot about the gold rush in San Francisco, which had began in January 24th, apparently, 1848. And that was when gold was found by James W. Marshall at Sutter's Mill in Colma, California. News of gold brought approximately 300,000 people to California from all around the United States and abroad. And the sudden influx of gold into the money supply rejuvenated the American economy. Now, John and his new friend, who he met through Petrie, was Daniel Dad Cunningham. A lot of people called him Dad Cunningham. They were officially sold on this idea of this gold rush. And they decided to leave rotten New York in 1850 for an adventure in San Francisco. Now, they had $13 between them. So John Petrie borrowed them the rest to get there. We don't know how much, but that was what it was. John went home, said his goodbyes to his mother, met his girlfriend Susie, said goodbye to her too. You know, I've got this adventure, I'm going to be rich. Now, it was too dangerous to travel to San Francisco by land in this time. You had to go through the Mojave Desert and the Death Valley, and many men had died taking this route. Apparently, there were some horrific stories of guys digging their own graves. So they decided to travel by ship via Panama, which would take up to 43 days. Now, the Chicago Tribune explained their adventure from Troy. And he said their first step, because obviously they're in Troy, they've gone to see his mum. So their first step was to steal a ride to New York on a freight train. Their second was on board a Pacific mail steamer to Panama.
After the ship had been 3 days at sea, they were discovered with the lower deck passengers when officers came around to collect the tickets. The stowaways were requested to step up to the captain's office and settle. They told the captain that they had no ticket nor any money, so the captain assured them that they had little chance of seeing San Francisco, as he would be taking them back with him to New York and making them work their passage in the coal bunkers. While they were waiting to dock, Morrissey got into an altercation with another gang member and agreed to a shootout once they arrived in Panama. However, as the steamer was in the process of anchoring down, they seized an opportunity, and the Chicago Tribune explained a number of boats rowed by natives had put her off course, as in the main boat. Morrissey and Cunningham saw their chance. They waited until several boats were alongside the steamer, and in the confusion they slipped over the vessel's side and dropped into one. They seized the paddles from two of the natives and threatened to shoot them if they made a sound. After taking over the boat, Morrissey and Cunningham were rowing for dear life before the people on board had comprehended their sudden movement. They actually reached the shore without getting caught. They waited for the gang member to get off the boat so they could have their shootout, but he never did. Instead, the pair of scallywags began to make their way on foot. Still some distance from Panama, they bought 2 tickets on another steamer heading up the Chagres River to Gorgona. They walked the 36-mile journey between Gorgona to Panama, arriving at their destination with just $5 between them. To their amazement, they found 7,000 people at Panama awaiting shipment to San Francisco. The market price of a ticket was ranging between $1,200 to $1,500.
Well, there was no chance to get to San Francisco as stowaways, because guards were actually posted night and day to prevent people who had no tickets from getting on board. Now, they were determined to raise the money at first, and they spent 6 weeks in Panama enjoying themselves in the gambling houses. They actually managed to turn their $5 into $700, but the price to buy 2 tickets by that point would set them back $2,500. So they gambled a lot. And what did they do? They lost a lot. And John Morrissey himself said that at this moment in time, they were flat broke and had to figure out another way of boarding that ship. Again, the Chicago Tribune, who explained basically this whole journey, described that about 10 o'clock at night, they strolled down the beach, they stole a boat and quickly rowed out into the direction of the ship. They got within 50 yards when a guard spotted them and he shouted, "Who goes there?" They stopped rowing, they didn't answer. The next moment, the guard discharged his firearm towards them. They turned around and hurried back to shore, where they left the boat and legged it to land. They had one more night left until that ship was set to sail to San Francisco, and they waited until the very last minute to pick their moment. The Chicago Tribune again explained, during the evening, they managed to get on board a cargo boat which was heading towards the ship. When they got alongside the ship, Morrissey and Cunningham grabbed a large packing case, and in the flurry and bustle, they succeeded in losing themselves in a crowd of passengers, and they hid away in the lower deck until the steamer was miles on her way before they ventured on deck the next morning. Obviously, they were starving, so they begged their breakfast, and they were caught by lunchtime. Again, the Tribune wrote, the captain who caught them with another guard asked them how they dared to come on board without tickets or money. And, well, Morrissey began to talk his way out of the situation.
Morrissey replied, "Now, see here, Cap, I suppose you have many chaps like us to deal with, and a good many of promises made, but I've got friends, good friends in San Francisco, and if you'll take us ashore there, I know they'll raise the money to pay our passages." The captain was not sold, and he replied, "Put these fellows ashore at Acapulco. That's just about 1,500 miles from Panama and 1,500 miles from San Francisco, basically in the middle. You'll find it pretty hard to get away from there. I guess that's the best punishment for you." Now the captain was about to go through with his threat, but then an opportunity rose that Morrissey took advantage of. The day before reaching Acapulco, an angry mob were threatening to take control of all the cabins, saloons, and the first-class passengers. Morrissey and Cunningham could have just joined that angry mob, but instead they actually chose to assist the captain who had requested their services as a matter of urgency. The next morning, Morrissey and Cunningham were provided with shivs and guns. They took their stand among the sailors. As soon as the mob came on deck to carry out their plan of seizing the ship, the sailors, the captain, Morrissey and Cunningham were ready, with a shiv in one hand and a revolver in the other. When the mob saw that Morrissey and Cunningham were ready to defend the ship, they retreated and accepted surrender. The captain rewarded Morrissey and Cunningham for their plucky services by promising to take them to San Francisco, making them first-class passengers and giving them a first-class cabin. That was the only luxury they had for some time, because when they finally arrived in San Francisco, they were potless, with nowhere to stay. They tried desperately to acquire security work in the gambling houses, but they were turned away. San Francisco was not the type of place that Morrissey and Cunningham had expected it to be.
A bit like when his mother arrived in America. It's becoming, the grass really isn't always greener. And so a backpacker that followed the story of John Morrissey had his scribes actually printed in the Evening Star, and it explained just how dangerous it was to live in San Francisco. And it said San Francisco was an old Spanish and Indian village, which had become in 3 or 4 years a seething city and one of the lawless towns on earth. A historian of the Vigilance Committee, also known as the Vigilantes, had written that a district attorney said that in the years of 1815 and 1853, there were 1,200 murders in San Francisco without one legal hanging. Of course, that was a thing back then. Now, the figures take no account of the shooting and knifing of men, and the lawlessness caused the formation of the Committee of the Vigilance, which supported by men who aimed to give San Francisco a better government than the older cities, or the other older cities around New York City and Boston, etc. Now, the article went on to describe the murder of a guy called James King, who was a banker and editor for the Evening Bulletin. Now, his murderer was a guy called James Casey, who was a leading politician at the time. Now, it said that he was hanged from the second-story window of the headquarters of the Vigilance Committee in sight of thousands who were kept in order by armed vigilantes. Now, Morrissey and Cunningham thought, what the fuck have they got themselves into from New York? I bet they thought New York's a better place. You know, they left that dangerous streets of New York thinking it's a better place and ended up actually it's probably much worse. And with not a pot to piss in, they had to sleep in a small, dirty room and hustle for food and water. They were actually worse off than they were in New York. But then one evening, their luck changed. they stumbled across a drunken man in the gutter getting mugged by two thugs. Morrissey noticed the man's wealth by the way he was dressed, so he seized an opportunity, he intervened, and he gave the two fellas a good old beating and sent them on their way. Together with Cunningham, they carried the victim home.
Well, as luck would have it, the victim was a wealthy Englishman named Langham, and as a sign of gratitude he allowed his two saviours to stay in a gambling room of their own. They were back in business, Morrissey and Cunningham. They were hired to assist in the gambling room and began to earn some decent money again. While debating on their next move, Tom Hyer, the recognised heavyweight champion of America, actually arrived in San Francisco with his trainer George Thompson for a fight. After making a successful defence, Morrissey actually tried to secure a fight with Hyer, but he was disregarded. The champ was clearly not interested in fighting a younger man, so he headed back to New York, leaving George behind. John was beginning to make his presence known in San Francisco and making plenty of friends who believed he actually could beat the Scotsman George Thompson, and if he did, then Hyer's hand would be forced to defend his title against Morrissey. Sensing easy money, John and George got into an argument which resulted in a match being confirmed for $2,000 each at Mare Island on August the 31st, 1852. The fight was competitive and both had their moments of success. Thompson was the more polished boxer, but Morrissey was aggressive throughout the fight. In the 10th round, George, seeking to evade another attack, tried to wrestle his opponent down. In his efforts, he seized John by the hip and slung him to the ground. The referee immediately disqualified the Scot for a foul, and John Morrissey was the winner. Although it wasn't quite the result John wanted, he was still the victor, and he revelled in his popularity. He also earned himself a nice $2,000 and had accepted a bet for another $5,000. The bet was with the owner of a gambling saloon called Tom Maguire, who was infatuated with a 16-year-old Mexican girl called Lolita Fernandez.
Well, John at 19 was currently courting Fernandez, and in his desperation, Maguire confessed his love for John's new squeeze and gave him an offer that he couldn't refuse. He explained, "There's a horse race and it's even money. I'll bet you $5,000 against Lolita and let you pick the horse." John smiled and said, "It's a bet." Now, Cunningham, luckily, was a keen gambler and advised John on which horse to pick. Cunningham's instinct was right, and the horse came in, and John won the money and the girl. But they were eager to get back to New York by this point. They had enough of San Francisco, and after bagging themselves $7,000 in all with the fight and the bet, they had enough money to return home finally. So John was smug, obviously, after this with Tom, but he gave permission for Tom Maguire to try his luck with Lolita. And apparently this is what John said to him. He said, "She won't miss me, not as long as you've got money, and there are enough men in San Francisco to take your place when you're tired. Good luck, Maguire, and goodbye. We're pulling stakes tomorrow." So that was it. They left San Fran. Now, by the time Morrissey and Cunningham returned to New York in October of 1852, some say 53, a secret society had formed, and it was known as the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, to become a member, you had to pass an initiation ritual called Seeing Sam. They had to memorize passwords and hand signs, but also had to be a Protestant with Anglo-Saxon heritage. All Catholics were rejected. Now, members of this secret society weren't allowed to talk about this society, just like if you've seen the film, you don't talk about Fight Club. Now, if asked, "Have you seen Sam?" they would respond by saying, "I know nothing." And they rose to prominence in 1853 and transformed into a powerful political party known as the Know Nothings. At its height in the 1850s, the Know Nothing Party, originally called the American Party, included more than 100 elected congressmen, 8 governors, a controlling share of half a dozen of state parliaments from Massachusetts to California, and thousands and thousands of local politicians.
Sounds a little bit like the Illuminati, this, doesn't it? Like,
It
there's
does, doesn't it?
secret
Yeah.
societies and hand gestures, and, there's a conspiracy theory about a lot of celebrities doing that triangular sign when they're doing performances. Rihanna did it quite recently in one of her
Kanye.
performances. Kanye's done it, yeah. It's sounding very much a little bit like this, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Now, party members supported deportation of foreign beggars and criminals, mandatory Bible reading in schools, and the elimination of all Catholics from public office. There were other gangs that opposed or supported the Know-Nothings, and they were known as the Wide Awakes, the Pug Uglies, Rip Hats, the Bowery Boys, and the Dead Rabbits. I mean, some of these names, looking back, look absolutely hilarious. But
Innit?
how could you get away with walking down the street in this day and age saying, yeah, if you start with me, I'm going to get the rest of my Pug Uglies to come and get you? I mean, it sounds absolutely ludicrous. But the reality is, this was like the real-life version of that film, Gangs of New York. And that was the film I mentioned at the top of the episode, starring Daniel Day-Lewis as Bill the Butcher, Leonardo DiCaprio as Amsterdam Vallon, Liam Neeson as Priest Vallon, and Cameron Diaz as Jenny Everdeen. New York's politicians had already used immigration and gangs as a tool to gather votes illegally, and it was no different when John arrived back from San Francisco. A man named Fernando Wood, who turned to politics after amassing a fortune by shipping goods to California during the gold rush, was actually beginning to gain recognition as a political power for Tammany Hall. Now, the Butcher, as we mentioned earlier on in the story, and his Bowery Boys actually aligned with the opposition, called the Whigs. He was ready to actually dislodge any chances of Wood getting into the mayor's chair. Poole was willing to go to any lengths to prevent that from happening, and there was no secrecy about his plans. He announced his intention of raiding the polling place in 23rd Street and destroying ballots. There was little help to look for from the police because they were just as corrupt as the gangs in this day. Now, the day before the elections of 1853, John Morrissey received a request to call in on the Superintendent of Police, John A. Kennedy. He found Fernando Wood in a meeting with the police chief. Wood asked John Morrissey to sit down. You are just the man I want to see. John seated himself, but he was suspicious, and Wood declared, I am, of course, extremely anxious to win this election. As you know, elections are not won by voters, but by the gentlemen who count the votes.
And that's where John laughed, because obviously he knows all about that. And he said, I know what you're talking about. What do you want me to do? You know Butcher Bill Paul? Asked Wood. Yes, of course, replied John Morrissey. And Wood explained that it seems Mr. Paul has announced that he intends to raid a number of polling places and destroy democratic ballots. This would be most unfortunate. You can imagine how this guy spoke. And John obviously interrupted. What do you want me to do? He said, asked John. And Fernando replied, I want you to be tougher than Paul. I want you to collect a gang that can do to him what he wants to do to us. It will be worth your while, he said. Well, Morrissey laughed and said, I'd do it for nothing. So John was already well known, as we know, especially in Troy and now in New York. And everyone knew he was against the ideologies of Paul and had this beef, obviously, before. But he needed to gather enough reinforcements to combat his rival if he was to be successful for what Wood asked him to do. Now, the Dead Rabbits was the name of the Irish-American street gang who were active in Lower Manhattan during 1830s to the 1850s. They actually got their name after a dead rabbit was thrown to the center of the room during a gang meeting, prompting some members to treat that as an omen. So they withdrew and formed their independent gang. Very religious ties, you know, these omens, and it's very superstitious. Now, their battle symbol was obviously the dead rabbit on a pike, like what you see at the very start of the film Gangs in New York with Liam Neeson. Now, they often clashed with nativist politician groups who viewed Irish Catholics as threatening and criminals. The Dead Rabbits were given nicknames as well, the Mulberry Boys, the Mulberry Street Boys, by the New York City Police Department, because they were known to have operated in that Mulberry Street away from the 5 Points, just a few roads down, now Chinatown. Now, the Dead Rabbits supported Fernando Wood and opposed Paul's Bowery Boys. Morrissey used his initiative and aligned himself with the Dead Rabbits, and he offered to pay each representative $1 for assisting him in defending the ballot boxes, or some have suggested a pint for every Bowery Boy head they crack.
From the moment John Morrissey was almost beaten to death, he was always eager to exact revenge on the Butcher, so this was the perfect opportunity to do exactly that. Their rivalry was ready to erupt. Bill the Butcher and the Bowery Boys planned to raid the Irish polling station on 23rd Street. The way they intimidated was by blocking a ballot box and threatening the people arriving to vote, a tactic that had been used many times before. Poole had no reason to suspect that this day would be any different. He was ready to affect the votes so it swayed in the way he wanted it to, but what he didn't anticipate was that the Tammany Hall would recruit Morrissey and use his influence with the Dead Rabbits to force the Bowery Boys into retreat. Tammany Hall was the main local political machine of the Democratic Party and played a major role in controlling New York City and New York State politics by helping immigrants, most notably the Irish. Morrissey gathered his men at the polling station. By the time the Bowery Boys arrived, they were welcomed by Morrissey and the Dead Rabbits, who had rigged the place and had them outnumbered. Poole said, "Well, if it ain't John Morrissey. Have you not forgotten the last time we met and I beat your face into a pulp? Stand aside, or you'll be sorry." Morrissey replied, "Poole, you're outnumbered. The good people of this place are voting for the people who take care of them, and you can't stop them." Poole and Morrissey came within feet of each other. Poole called his nemesis a sneaky Irish bastard and said, "I should have killed you when I had the chance." But Poole had a decision to make. If he leaves, he's going to be humiliated by his rival Morrissey. But to take on the larger gang, well, it would just be suicide.
Yeah, so Paul may have been a monster. He was. This guy was a nasty piece of shit. But he wasn't stupid. And his sense obviously took over. And he knew that he was outnumbered. So he began to retreat. Of course, Morrissey couldn't help but stick the boot in. And he said, "This is a sight we will get used to, boys. A native ready to talk towel and run away." Well, Paul had to take his medicine. And he left with his own parting shot as well. And he said, "You'll pay for this, I swear," apparently. I mean, we don't know word for word, but this is, it changes, but this is roughly what we think, probably how it went down. However, Paul's reputation had taken a severe battering. He had walked away from a fight and was beaten by an immigrant, an Irishman, and their rivalry was already sizzling, but it had just become way more ferocious, and it eventually comes to a head. John was enjoying the fruits of his labour and expecting Wood to become mayor after helping him out in that, but unfortunately he lost the election. Not that it mattered, because a Democratic leader of Tammany Hall was in place in office, so it went the same side as Wood, but obviously not to Wood. So John was now working alongside politicians. He's earning money from gambling houses and was still an active prize fighter. So when Tom Hyer retired as the recognised American champion, he actually passed the title over, and many accepted Yankee Sullivan as his successor. However, he would need to beat John Morrissey, who was now considered to be the legitimate contender to the new crown he had acquired. Then one night they met in a saloon, and Yankee said, "There's the tough young bantam who thinks he can whip me." And Morrissey replied, "I can lick you for fun or money anytime you want." "For how much?" "For as much as your friends have. You wouldn't have a shilling unless you robbed a drunken man before you came in." Now, Sullivan was actually known for robberies, mugging people, and he actually took that insult personally, and he approached John. But it was forced back by his entourage, of course, probably just making it out like he's got the bollocks. And he agreed, "All right, let's meet tomorrow and get this thing settled." And Morrissey responded with more money and less words. So they met the next day, but they never actually had a fight. Instead, they agreed to a fight on October the 12th, 1853, at the Boston corners of the line of Harlem Railroad. So this is basically on a railroad now. And it was 100 miles from New York.
The venue was agreed on the flip of a coin. Morrissey won the toss and actually chose the venue. When the day arrived, the ring was pitched a quarter mile from the station. By 11 o'clock, 2,000 or 3,000 men had assembled around it, smoking, drinking, offering wagers. When Morrissey arrived with his seconds, he began proceeding with the tradition of throwing his hat in the ring. John's head cornerman, Awful Gardner, tied John's colours to one of the stakes. The scarf was engraved the Stars and Stripes. Now Billy Wilson in Sullivan's corner fastened the champion's colours to an opposite stake, a black handkerchief that suggested a symbol of victory or death. Morrissey was much younger, 3 inches taller and 20 pounds heavier than Sullivan, who was old enough to be his dad. The butcher was also in attendance and of course backing Sullivan. The fight was a bloody battle, with both men looking terrible by all accounts. They were covered in blood and had swollen eyes, and it went all the way to 37 rounds. But remember, this was not 3-minute rounds like it is now. It's not sanctioned rounds like we know it today. A round actually only ended when a fighter fell, was knocked down or was thrown. Matches ended when a fighter was knocked out cold or could not stand up at the beginning of a round. Each fighter was given 30 seconds to recover before beginning the next round. Now by the last round, Morrissey's face looked like a swollen Freddy Krueger, but he would not quit, and a melee ensued in the 37th round in protest for Morrissey wrestling Sullivan to the canvas. Sullivan was in the thick of the melee, so much so that he actually lost all concept of time while fighting outside the ring. When the referee called for Sullivan to rejoin the centre of the ring, where Morrissey was ready and waiting, he actually missed the call. In fact, most sources suggest that he was given plenty of time to restart the fight, but he never did. And the fact that these guys were just fighting outside of the ring, it's a bit like WWE. Like
It's like WWE.
Yeah, he gets outside the ring, he's scrapping with a load of people outside the ring, forgetting the fact that John Morrissey's waiting for him in the ring to get back in and carry on the fight. You can just picture the scenes.
Yeah, it's brilliant because this was actually real. They're all an absolute mess. He probably can't even see Sullivan, but he's getting involved. I mean, some people say Morrissey got involved, but by most sources, it suggests that he was the one in the ring and waiting. And therefore, obviously, as you say, Sean, he's running around beating other people up. Instead of Morrissey, Sullivan was effectively counted out by the referee, who awarded John Morrissey the decision, becoming the new American heavyweight champion. So now the new American heavyweight champion is John Morrissey. Obviously, Sullivan and his corner protested, but in the end, they actually accepted their mistake and the loss. The battle was over, but the war was not. It was just a ceasefire. Sullivan was later arrested in Lenox, Massachusetts for participating in an illegal prize match. I mean, this guy, he's had a fight. He goes and has a fight outside the ring, and he goes and has another fight. Crazy. Well, John himself just escaped being arrested, but he would later be charged. There was no secret about Yankee's unsavory reputation either. Now, he was a bad man who deserved nothing better than jail time, and the authorities were actually anxious to keep him in there. However, Tom Hyer, the former champion, raised enough money among other sportsmen and thugs within New York to buy freedom for the former champion, and even Morrissey apparently contributed generously to the fund. Now, he could afford to by this point because he and John Petrie had actually become partners now in a gambling house business, and his wealth had increased incredibly. He wore fine suits, starched shirts, and even a modest diamond or two. He had come a very long way in a very short space of time. Because boxing was illegal, the new American heavyweight champion was actually court summoned on July the 22nd, 1854, months after the prize fight with Sullivan. And the New York Clipper wrote that the grand jury of Berkshire County prepared a bill against John Morrissey for his part in the late disgraceful Boston Four Corners prize fight. He was brought into court and pleaded guilty. His voluntary surrender and good behaviour since the fight were urged in extenuation, but in accordance with the statute, he was sentenced to pay $1,200 or suffer imprisonment in the state prison for 16 months. The fine, of course, was paid. Who wants to go to prison? And Morrissey was discharged. Now, John's good behaviour wouldn't last. He actually got engaged with Susie not long after the fight, and they were due to wed in 6 months, but then something else happened.
Something else happens indeed, and at this point he's America's heavyweight champion, is running a successful gambling house and was due to marry. So he's in great spirits. One morning though, he began to drink early with his closest pals, celebrating how good life was and how far he had come in that short space of time. By late afternoon, he walked into a bar and demanded a whiskey, but the barman refused and said, "You've had enough now, Mr. Morrissey, why don't you take a little nap somewhere?" Not happy with the response, he demanded again, "Give me a whiskey." The bartender signalled to a couple of his bigger waiters to help him remove the drunken champion. John turned to face the two men and blurted, "I'm John Morrissey, and I'm going to do just what I goddamn please." He pushed one away, and then the other tried to grab him, but John shook himself loose and pulled out a pistol from his pocket. "Ah, you would you? I've never killed a man yet, but I'm going to now." Now, because he was so pissed, he actually fumbled for the trigger, and he was unable to shoot his gun. Those in the room grabbed him so he couldn't fire, then the police suddenly appeared. He was taken to the station, where he slept off his drunkenness for hours. He was then dragged before a judge, where he apparently felt genuinely embarrassed, but assumed that he could just pay off a few people and then get released. However, John's enemies were anxious to keep him in jail. To his surprise, he wasn't immediately released. Bail for the amount of $2,000 was served, and while he debated whether to pay the fine, his partner, John Petrie, paid the full amount to gain him temporary freedom. Someone within a political position was putting the pressure on to have Morrissey sent down for attempted murder, and it actually looked like he was going to end up going down for a long stretch.
Well, in desperation, he went to see a guy called A. Oakley Hall, who was the district attorney. Now, he would later become mayor of New York and a member of the Tweed Rig, which we'll come to that later. Now, Morrissey pleaded with him. He said, "You can't let him do this to me. I'm going to get married. If that's spoiled, well, this town will have things happen that have never happened to it before. I've done lots for this party. Now the party has got to do something for me." Well, Oakley agreed. He said, "All right, I'll ask Recorder Smith to let the case go over another term. By that time, it'll all be forgotten. But you will have to be more careful in the future, Morrissey. Prominent people in this city have been urging me to curb the doings of men like you. I can't afford to offend them, even though you have been great value to us." How quickly these guys can kick you out the curb, mate. They don't care. Well, John accepted the warning and he said, "That's fine. I won't forget about this, Oakley." And, well, the recorder accepted the district attorney's suggestion and the case was eventually dropped. Well, Morrissey and Susie eventually did get married. John was busy managing his gambling house and his political activity on behalf of Fernando Wood. Now, Tammany Hall was actually divided. Each faction intended on nominating its own candidate for mayor. Now, Wood, he actually became a nominee for the 1855 elections and wanted the backing of the Know Nothings. But Morrissey insisted, "Look, this is going to be a bad strategy. Don't do it." And he took his advice. It was said that Fernando Wood once actually managed to neutralize some 3,500 men in one day by sending them to a judge with pre-printed cards requesting his signature as a personal consideration. So look, it's so corrupt. It's unbelievable. And it's almost certain that John assisted him in the roundup of those men and obviously voted for Wood, who was elected the new mayor and oversaw the construction as well of the planned Central Park. John Morrissey, having sided with the winner now, was in an even greater position than he even was before.
Now a close associate with the new mayor of New York, Morrissey had wealth and the backing of the immigrants. On the other side, under the banner of the Native Americans, was former heavyweight champion Tom Hyer and his friend Bill the Butcher Poole. Morrissey and Hyer met at the Union Court on Long Island and exchanged words. They continued their war of words in Dick Platt's saloon. John insisted on a fight, but Hyer wanted no part of the fight game anymore. The argument progressed when two of John's supporters, Lou Baker and Jim Turner, turned the verbals into a physical fight. Now, we found an in-depth account of what happened between Morrissey and Poole over the next few days. That was actually published by Edward Van Every and prepared by Frederick A. Stokes and then transcribed by Miriam Medina. Writer Richard K. Fox co-wrote a piece sometime in the late 1800s with Theodore Allen playing the most valuable part as eyewitness. Named simply as the Allen, he was the owner of the Bal-Mabille, one of the leading resorts of the time. He had a record of 30 years as a political bully and keeper of gambling houses. Allen had been more than an eyewitness to the Morrissey Poole episode. He had actually also played an important part throughout the entire history of violence. He began as a helper in Poole's butcher market and became a political protege of Bill the Butcher. He gave an account of the whole drama, which was printed in the Police Gazette, and this is what it reads. Jim, as in Jim Turner, drew a gun and shot at Hyer. The ball grazed the champion's neck. Hyer turned to Turner and drew his own gun and discharged a shot into the wall. The smoke was still curling from his pistol when he saw the reflection of Turner in a mirror, cocking his pistol again. Manoeuvring quickly, he grabbed Turner by the neck and threw him violently to the floor.
Well, at the same time, Baker attacked Hyer from behind using the butt of his gun, and he whacked him on the head. Hyer then turned his attention to Baker and was proceeding to beat him up when a policeman entered. Hyer turned Baker over to the officer for arrest, but the representative of the law declined to intervene, what he actually termed as a private dispute, even though Baker had apparently drawn a knife. So Hyer proceeded to finish off Baker and he dumped him off in the gutter. And so the war was on between the rival political brawlers. Baker got actually another beating a few days later from Poole, who would have probably taken both of his eyes out if the police had not interrupted that time, and they did this time assist. So after this incident, it was actually John Morrissey who claimed that he was going to get Bill the Butcher. Poole, by now, had given up his butcher business and actually started a drinking place called the Bank Exchange. Now, his admirers, in celebration of the venture, actually arranged a grand ball on his behalf in the Chinese assembly room. Now, Morrissey and many of his followers attended, but nothing of a troublesome nature happened until after the ball was over. The two met in the bar of the City Hotel, which was opposite Poole's place of business. Morrissey was standing at the bar as Poole entered and advanced towards him. The place was full of people, and all talk died down when the two began eyeballing each other. Morrissey was the first to speak. He spat his cigar from his mouth and then said defiantly, "There stands the black-muzzled American fighter." Poole responded sneeringly with his favourite expression, "Yes, and I'm dandy." And then Morrissey responded, "I can beat the dandy out of you tomorrow morning. What is more, I'll bet you $500 you don't dare meet me and you can name the place." And he put $50 as a forfeit in the hands of a guy called George Deagle, who was the chief clerk at the hotel. Poole suggested, "How about Christopher Street?"
He had named a location within 2 or 3 blocks of his own home. Now, Big Tom Burns, one of Morrissey's friends, protested and said, "Don't go there, John. That's Poole's headquarters. His gang will never let you get away alive." After a moment's hesitation, Morrissey tossed over $50 to Poole and dared him to name another place. "How will the Amos Street dock suit you?" asked Poole. "That's satisfactory," was the bold answer from Morrissey. "I'll be there bright and early," promised Poole. 5 o'clock in the morning, Poole came up to the Amos Street dock in a coach, accompanied by Smut Ackerman, Tommy Culkin, and Allen. Amos Street Wharf was the next one above the Christopher Street dock. Morrissey had not yet arrived, but a number of his friends had in coaches. Poole's friends were lying in wait for them, and every carriage was stopped and emptied. A fight invariably ensued, which ended in Old Smoke's supporters making their departure for home or a hospital. It was nearing 7 a.m. when Morrissey arrived with a friend in a light wagon. He came with Johnny Ling, owner of the Sportsman's headquarters, and they walked toward us, arm in arm. The crowd was swarmed on the dock, made for a lane for them to pass through, and everything was very orderly thus far. Even the hundreds who crowded the roofs and windows of the adjacent buildings were quiet. But among the people on the pier was John Poole, Bill's brother. He had been mauled in Ling's place and was seeking revenge. As Ling passed John Poole, Bill's brother struck his enemy with a smashing blow on the jaw. In a second, there was a fight. No one attempted to bother Morrissey, who stood quietly looking on, but his followers fared badly. They were given a thorough thrashing, after which their revolvers were taken from them and tossed into the river.
So after this slight delay, the leaders were permitted to get down to business. There was no ring, but by general consent, the crowd had kept a space open for the combat. Paul, in his undershirt, was ready. Morrissey, threw off his coat and white shirt, was also ready. Now, each stood over 6 feet and weighed close to 200 pounds, which is, is big back then. The fight began with some light sparring, and Paul was on the defensive as his opponent circled about for a chance to close. For about 5 minutes, this child's play lasted. Then Morrissey made a rush, but Paul was too quick for him. As Old Smoke made his lunge, Bill the Butcher ducked with remarkable agility and seized him by the ankles. In a flash, Paul threw his opponent clean over his head, and as Old Smoke went sprawling, he had only time to roll over to his back when Bill pounced on him like a tiger. Then followed terrible minutes of fighting. Clutching each other, they butted and pounded their heads and bodies together, tearing at each other's faces with their teeth and gouging for eyes with their fingers. It was sickening to watch, for in no time they were frightfully punished. There was a long gash in Paul's cheek where the flesh had been torn by his opponent's teeth. The blood was streaming from Morrissey's eyes. They never changed positions while the struggle went on. For the minute they were down, the crowd closed in on them. They were lucky not to be trampled to death. Not a hand was raised to interfere with or favour either contestant during the 2 or 3 minutes this inhumane struggle lasted. But Morrissey was underneath and was doomed to defeat. And soon his voice was heard, suffocating with blood. "I'm satisfied," he gasped. "I'm done." A cheer went from the crowd and a shout rang out, "Paul's won! Paul's won!"
Now, as you can tell by the Allen's account, which is what we've just read out to you there, this version, of course, is going to be absolutely biased towards Poole. Now, Ed James of the Clipper was one of the best-known newspapermen of the day, and he pointed out that a number of Poole supporters joined in and beat and kicked Morrissey while he lay upon the ground until the wonder was he was not killed. The Allen explained what happened next and said that was the end of the great fight between John Morrissey and Bill Poole, but not of the day's excitement nor of many more days of turbulence. An attack was started on Morrissey as he started to depart from the scene of his defeat. If not for a few brave friends and some fair-minded among the enemy, he would have been carried off to Lord knows what fate. He finally got safely away to the Bella Union Saloon, of which he was a part owner. Within less than an hour after the crowds had cleared from the Amos Street dock, Smut Ackerman was demonstrating how his friend Poole had thrown Morrissey. But he, in showing that, actually slipped and suffered a fatal fracture of his skull. The Allen explained, as the dying man was being taken to the New York hospital, the street was packed with friends of Morrissey's, all hot with rage. The horse and cart which was carrying the dying man was pinned in by a threatening crowd. Directly opposite was the 5th Precinct station. As the Morrissey men closed in on their prey, the door of the station house opened and everyone made a run for it. Beating back the mob, they escorted the cart to the hospital. But it was too late. Ackerman died late that afternoon. Ackerman was not even in his grave before the two factions were fighting again. The Bowery boys and the Short boys who supported Morrissey had it in for Allen for the part he had played in Poole's victory.
Morrissey getting kicked while he was on the floor, which is other accounts. So a guy called Paul Jean McCullen actually ran into Allen and he challenged him to a fight in the New York hospital grounds, which is a common place to fight at their differences. And Paul Jean, however, was so spoiling for a fight that he smashed Allen in the jaw and a fight broke out again. Now, Harry O'Donnell then fired a pistol at Allen during the scuffle and challenged Allen to a fight on Harrison Street. It's just all out war in a minute. Now, apparently O'Donnell was well handled by Allen and wound up being thrown into the water. The evening was topped off with more fighting, in which knives and brass knuckles were brought into play. A few nights later, Allen and two friends were actually trapped in Brady's Hall by the Short boys. Policeman Rogers was terribly beaten and his partner Sullivan was actually beaten to death. Allen was taken away to the Star Hotel, where apparently his eyes had been gouged out from their sockets and hung on his cheeks. A skillful operation restored them to place. He lay in bed for several weeks blind. The first day he was permitted out by his physician. He hunted down Bob Lynn, who had been the ringleader of the attack against him, and Lynn was found and almost killed. For this, 3 days later, Allen was arrested and taken before Judge Davidson, and Paul accompanied him. Morris Underhill, a court officer and a friend of Morrissey's, actually got into words with the butcher, and soon the two were fighting right there in the courtroom. Underhill actually went on to lose sight of one of his eyes, while Paul was never ever brought to justice for the disrespect that he showed in court. Well, it's crazy. Tensions are high now, higher than ever. Allen described that what happened next on February the 24th, 1855 at the Stanwicks. And this is where it all boils to this event, this one moment. And this is what he said. He said, a little after 10 o'clock that evening, Charlie Lozier, Kay Shea, Jimmy Acker, and myself, Allen, dropped into Stanwicks Hall, which was newly opened. The Stanwicks was one of the finest liquor stores and bars in the city.
During the night, Poole and Mark McGuire got into an argument. Poole took a bread knife from behind the bar and tossed it at McGuire, deliberately missing and challenging him to a fight. A detective named Chris Hogan came between the two to smooth out the trouble. At this injunction, the door opened, and in came Morrissey with several of his friends. When John walked into the Stanwicks Hall, where Poole and his gang were, he called him out. Poole, I'm glad I got here in time. And I'm John Brown, the butter man. Which apparently means he intends on doing his enemy bodily harm. Chris Hogan once again intervened and said, don't you start nothing, Morrissey. At that point, John pulled out his pistol. The men around Poole moved away and Morrissey squeezed the trigger. Twice. But it jammed. And he threw it to the floor and said, oh, you're always lucky. The butcher reached over the counter, grabbed two carving knives and hurled them at the bar, then shouted, there, you son of a bitch, take your pick, I'll fight you with them. John laughed. Do you think I'm a fool? Knives are for butchers like you to cut dead pigs with. You've got hands. You brag about being great with them? Let's see. Just as it looked like another scrap would materialise, the door opened and in poured a dozen policemen, headed by Captain Turnbull. Hogan, smelling trouble, had sent for reinforcements. The bartenders and patrons drew breaths of relief. You gentlemen are under arrest, said the officer to Morrissey and Poole, and he waved in for reinforcements. Neither argued, and they left without a fight. Turnbull told them, I don't want to take you fellows in, but I don't intend to have any trouble in this precinct. if you'll promise to go home and not show your faces north of Canal Street tonight, we'll forget about this. Morrissey agreed, and so did Poole. Now at this point, Johnston, this is just an all-out gang war between the two of them.
Fucking crazy, isn't it?
This comes completely away from the fact that, you know, boxing is involved at this point. Like, they've had these illegal fights, and you'd think, given the fact that John Morrissey lost that fight by the accounts of what we've discovered in the historical archives, he just couldn't help but go back for more. And then all of his associates are getting involved. People are getting their eyes gouged out. They're getting bits of flesh bitten off the faces. I mean, this just goes above and beyond what we normally would hear about or read about or even tell you about in terms of stories. This is really a different time completely, and it certainly goes way above and beyond anything that we've covered for the darker side of boxing.
Well, yeah, it does. I mean, there's not necessarily there is a crime that happens, but it's just chaos, isn't it? I mean, like, over a few days as well, it doesn't stop. We just got these different factions that are just constantly fighting each other, and obviously that fight with Paul wasn't even a legitimate fight. So people say Paul won the fight. Some have said, pretty much everyone says Paul wins that fight, but I think by the sounds of it and by all other accounts other than the Allens, I think Morrissey gets a little bit of a kicking while he's on the deck. So that's why he feels like he's been outdone by. And so look, this is it. So they've both been told to piss off home, haven't they, after this? And well, some suggest that Morrissey went home as promised, but the Allen obviously suggested otherwise. He said it is understood that he went down to Lying's sporting headquarters at Canal Street and Broadway, where he remained until he then went home to his newly wife. And obviously Lings was the guy that John Paul's brother had a madness with and punched him in the face. It's just pure commotion. Well, this is where some believe when he did go to Lings sporting headquarters, he may have rounded up his troops and gave them instructions before heading home. Now, what were those instructions? Well, the Allen continues. He says, well, Paul and the rest of us, they decided they're going to go back to Stanwix Hall. You know, after Paul's been told, stay away, he goes back anyway. This is because Bill insisted on making his apologies to Charlie Dean. He was the guy that ran the gaff. Now, we started there drinking and talking until sometime after midnight. The saloon was supposed to be closed and the curtains were down. Paul had just announced that it was time for him to go home when the door opened. And in walked Lou Baker, Eugene McLaughlin, Dan Cunningham, and several other of Morrissey's bunch, but not John. Now, among the party was Jim Turner, who had just come back from California, having been run out of town in San Francisco by those vigilantes, which Cunningham and Morrissey did not want any part of. So Paul Jean was the last to enter. And as he came in, he locked the door behind. Every soul present knew there was going to be bloodshed. Paul leaned coolly against the bar and watched Poojin drop the key into his pocket. And Poojin returned the glee and asked, "What are you looking at, you black-muzzled bastard?" "At you," was the reply. "Well, you're looking at a better man than yourself, so you're the American fighter, while Morrissey can beat you out of sight." As he said this, Poojin leaped at Paul and he grabbed him by the coat collar and he spat in Bill's face. At the same time, McLaughlin's followers drew their revolvers. Paul calmly shook his attacker off and offered to bet $500 that he could beat any of the party fairly. And he drew $5 and slapped them on the bar.
Turner, who had been fidgeting nervously, yelled, "Oh hell, that's sailing." And with that, he pulled aside his cloak and drew a long-barreled pistol, the type Mexicans use, and aimed it at Poole. As he pulled the trigger, someone shoved him and the ball went through his own arm. That was the signal for everyone to disperse. Unable to get out, those who had no stomach for the deadly gunfight took refuge behind counters and stools. One of the shots hit Poole in the leg. He grabbed Poojin, and as they struggled toward the door, another bullet hit Bill in the shoulder, and he dropped across the door, which someone had actually forced open by this point. Lou Baker jumped on Poole, and with his knee pressing into Bill's chest, and then before Bill's friends could get to him, He placed the pistol against Poole's body and fired twice. One bullet lodged in his heart and the other in his stomach. The sharp barking of the revolvers, the jangle of broken glass, the curses, blows and cries suddenly stopped. Then, as Poole's friends went for the assassin, Baker jumped to his feet and ran through the open door. He would have never escaped if it hadn't been for Turner. Directly after shooting himself in the arm, he dropped to the floor. He was close to the exit door when Baker fired his last shot and leaped away over him. Several of us tripped over Turner as we tried to catch Baker and fell to the floor. That was when the police came surging in. Poole was alive, but unconscious. The ambulance was sent for as he lay there breathing in short gasps. In the wrecked saloon, filled with smoke, he was cared for by his anxious friends until the ambulance arrived. The entire police force went in search of Lou Baker.
Well, everyone involved actually surrendered, and the only one that didn't was Lou Baker, who was actually captured 5 days later in Tenerife, believe it or not, and brought back to New York. He was indicted along with Turner, McLaughlin and others, while Poole actually lay on his deathbed. And while he was there, he accused Morrissey of ordering for him to be killed. The butcher hung him for 2 weeks before the end came. He had been removed to his home, and examination showed that while his heart had not been reached by the bullet, the pericardium had pierced, and there was no possibility of saving his life. So it's pierced his heart, but it's not gone all the way through. So he's alive somehow, and it's impossible to remove that bullet. Poole actually recovered consciousness at this point and made a statement that his death was due to an organisational plot by Morrissey. He swore that he had been unarmed on the night that he had been shot. His recuperation was only temporary, and on the 14th day, the physician in attendance announced the last hour was at hand. And William, the butcher Poole, heard the announcement. He looked up at Tom Hire, who had literally been constantly by his bedside the whole time, and apparently drew his last breath and managed to gasp, "I die a true American." Now, others obviously have elaborated on his final words, which said, "I think I'm a goner. If I die a true American. And what grieves me most is thinking that I've been murdered by a set of Irish, by John Morrissey in particular." So because of his known hatred for Poole, John Morrissey was arrested and held on a $1,000 bond as an accessory to murder by association. He was then actually found guilty of assault with the intent to take Poole's life, while McLaughlin, Baker and Turner were actually tried for the actual murder. Now, this is where it gets a little bit crazy. So you had two juries, and they actually disagreed on all the verdict of all the accused. So two different juries, and they couldn't come to a verdict. So they got a third trial, a third jury that was actually arranged in a different location. However, that third jury was hung. So all the authorities actually dropped the case, and every single one of them were released.
Wow, for the murder of somebody? I mean, and the conspiracy to murder there, and there's accessory to murder, and yet it was dropped. Madness.
So you do wonder if they probably, a few of those within the jury, they probably threatened them. That's what I think.
Yeah, there's got to have been some political payoff somewhere, quite obviously. I mean, John's affiliation clearly to politics at this point was very prominent, as we've told the story so far. So it wouldn't surprise me if there was some sort of influences down the line. Now, before we move on with the rest of John Morrissey's story, we're going to round off what happened to the other suspects and gang members. Now, Baker went to Paris and dropped out of sight. Turner ended a miserable existence on the San Francisco docks. And Pogene McLaughlin was shot to death by Dad Cunningham in a dispute on March the 22nd, 1858. Cunningham himself died 7 years later at the age of 38. Now, moving back to Morrissey, and there was not enough evidence to prove that he had any connection to the murder of Poole or with the rioting that followed at his funeral. Although it would seem that violence and gang life would create an unpopular perception of William the Butcher Poole, It was the opposite, as thousands actually turned out for his funeral. An account of his funeral service was explained by Theodore Allen, but we will concentrate on the aftermath of the funeral. And Theodore Allen, or as the Allen as we know him, he said the procession broke up into groups and returned to New York. Poole's gang and the Light Guards march. Opposite the New Haven Railroad depot, a strong party of Morrissey followers had positioned themselves. They consisted of members of the original Hounds, reinforced by a gang of buttenders and short boys led by Larry Aiken and Dan Lynn. As the Poole volunteers came within range, a volley of stones and bricks darkened the air. Another and another followed. The attack was so sudden that the spectators who were gathered in the street watching the parade had no time to get out of the way. A woman was killed, while a number of men and women were badly wounded. 5 of the Poole Guard were injured, and Canal Street soon became a battleground. The screams of gangsters and the cheers and shouts of the volunteers made a ringing chorus. Through the sharp crack of pistols, the crash of stones smashing windows and doors, and the screams of the wounded.
Cool. It's never going to end, is it? The fight continued for an hour when the Morrissey men, having used up all their missiles, were left without cover, and the Poole Guards proceeded to charge them with their weapons. Morrissey's gang did not have the stomach for a battle, so scattered as the 7th Regiment appeared upon the scene. The assailing party had a number of its members disabled and 2 lay dead. Allen then went on to explain that the Poole Guards got their vengeance later that night. The Hounds narrowly escaped with their lives, after which the Poole Legion returned to the village and celebrated long into the night. Bill Poole's burial had certainly been a grand and exciting occasion. The Allen was, again, it's clearly one-sided his views here, and he paints a picture of William Poole as the hero and John Morrissey and his gang as the villains. Now, although Morrissey hated Poole, he detested him, he did make a very interesting claim as well after his rival's murder. He said, "The butcher's mother was like mine. She didn't have nothing, and Bill didn't leave her anything to speak of. The saloon he had, the Bank Exchange, really belonged to the Brewers. They took it back after the funeral. The fellows that hung around with him, rats, that's what they were. They wouldn't have cared if the old lady died of starvation. I couldn't let her go on the town, could I? It wasn't her fault if Bill and I hated each other, was it? The few dollars I gave her didn't amount to much. So he sorted her out some money." There you go. That's what he reckons. So after these horrible events, Morrissey went back to upstate New York to join his wife, Susie. And with the butcher dead, he continued to increase his political and financial strength over the next few years. Although he assisted Mayor Wood to get to where he wanted, neither actually showed any loyalty to each other. It was a dog-eat-dog era. Both would have had their loyalties misplaced if they had have trusted each other in a way.
Well, let's just take a moment just to reflect on William Poole, Bill the Butcher Poole, because obviously at this point he exits the story as we move on with John Morrissey's story. But yeah, obviously there's definitely, accounts of people that were Bill's friends who of course are going to give biased accounts and of course are going to portray one side of the story. But obviously we've sourced many different bits of information for this episode. So I suppose you as a listener, you get to make up your own mind based on that information as to what he was really like. I mean, this is a very, very long time ago, guys. Well over 150 years ago when this stuff was happening. So it is really difficult to ever get a true picture of what really went down there. But by accounts of many people, it seemed like they were both as bad as each other throughout the course of this period of time. And I think that's the best way I can say that at this moment, at this decade, of this time, both Morrissey and Poole were clearly as bad as each other. And it ultimately was going to lead to one of them ending up dead. And in this instance, it was, of course, Bill Poole. And as we know, history is always written by the victors. So make of that what you will. But it's now time to move on in the story. Now, in Fernando Wood's second term, his control over Tammany Hall unravelled, and his handling of the police boiled over when the New York City Police and the Dead Rabbits clashed in famous riots. All the while, John was earning a fortune from his gambling houses and learned that politicians were just as savage as the gangsters. In the meantime, he was able to enhance his connections with the long-term goal of one day being able to become a politician himself. However, he would need to control his temper and curb his drinking if he wanted to become a political figure. The Lynchburg Daily Virginian reported on May the 11th, 1857, about 7 o'clock yesterday morning, a deadly encounter took place between John Morrissey and some of the waiters at the Girard House, in which several of the participants received severe, if not dangerous, wounds. At 4 o'clock yesterday morning, a couple of disorderly characters went into the restaurant of the Girard House and ordered breakfast. After having their meal, they refused to pay. Then a disturbance occurred between them and the employees of the establishment, resulting in the arrest of the rioters. 3 hours later, John Morrissey and his friend returned to the restaurant, where John Patterson threw a jug at the waiters, forcing William P. Conway, the carver of the saloon, to intervene. Morrissey then got involved and went to throw something at Conway, who drew his knife in self-defence. The report went on to explain that Morrissey drew a pistol and presented it to Conway, who in return pulled out his own gun. Shots were fired on both sides, but without effect. The assailants, as in Morrissey and Patterson, retreated to the street, where a number of other shots were fired. Conway and the waiters followed the pair, and a fight began, where cuts were received on both sides. Morrissey was cut in the neck with a knife, while Conway was also cut in the neck by Morrissey.
Jesus Christ. This is what you just saying about they're bad as each other. I think this is the proof, isn't it? The police actually arrived and tried to arrest Morrissey, but they failed. John Morrissey had a revolver in one hand and a knife in the other. Too difficult to detain for the three officers. That was until Officer Farrell arrived and he was able to arrest Morrissey. Obviously, he must have known him, and he took him into custody. Morrissey was held at the Fifth Ward Station House until noon and questioned before he was granted bail. Morrissey was indicted on 3 separate assault charges, one with intent to kill Thomas H. Bulmer, and for assaulting William P. Conway and John F. H. Daggett. So this is all in the same incident. Now, some suggest he was actually sentenced to 6 months of hard labour at Albany Penitentiary. Morrissey needed to get off the sauce, so he decided to break the promise he made to his wife, Susie. That was to never box again. So in 1858, Morrissey had developed another fierce rivalry with the Benicia boy, a guy called John Heenan. Now, he was up-and-coming prize fighter and was chasing the American heavyweight title. Now, he was actually a fellow Irishman whose family also came from Templemore County, Tipperary in Ireland. And even crazier is their parents were both called Mary and Timothy. They had sailed to America moments before the potato famine, and the similarities were just basically unparalleled. And they even fought side by side for the downtown party against John O'Rourke. However, Heenan was younger and not Morrissey's cup of tea. They were never quite rivals until the former champion Tom Hyde began to stir some shit. He sided with the younger fighter and taunted Morrissey, because Paul's dead and he was part of it, or he felt that he was. Their rivalry moved from the street to the newspapers, with both Heenan calling the champion out and John deflecting with politician-like responses. That was until the pressure became too much to bear, and many questioned his credibility. In the end, he buckled under the increasing pressure and he took the fight. This would be his last prize fight. Win or lose, he would retire for good. Morrissey took Heenan very seriously, and he trained like he had never trained before.
He would run several miles a day, spar often, lift weights, and ate well. His training regime was ahead of his time. By this point, Morrissey had become a better boxer than when he fought Yankee Sullivan. The fight for the Championship of America was held at Long Point, Canada, on October the 21st, 1858. The New York Herald called the title bout the Great Prize Fight, claiming 11 terrific rounds were fought in 22 minutes. The article went on to explain every round. However, we will use their description of the final round, and it reads, in the 11th and last, Heenan came up staggering and looking pitiful, the fight beaten entirely out of him in the latter part of the bout. He was hardly able to stand up when Morrissey hit him with a blow on the jugular, which knocked him out. He fell on his face as Morrissey stepped away. At the end of the fight, Morrissey jumped over the ropes and walked to the gambling house, while Heenan didn't recover his consciousness for half an hour after the fight was over. The New York Times reported that Morrissey beat him into the ground as a hammer beats a nail. They called it a triumph of brutality, and also provided a blow-by-blow account. Again, by these accounts, this was Morrissey's best performance in the ring, putting his doubters to bed that day. And as promised, Morrissey retired from the ring in 1859 at the age of 28, much to the relief of his wife. He wrote an open letter explaining his reasons. In short term, he wrote, I have no desire for further contest with any man. My duties to my family and myself require me to devote my time and efforts to purposes more worthy and advantageous. His fortune increased and his political importance grew, and so did his gambling enterprises. He amassed a small fortune when he befriended Cornelius Vanderbilt, who helped him lucratively navigate the stock market.
Well, his investment in a more elegant gambling house on the 24th Street in Manhattan earned him the most profit of all. Now, despite his tremendous overhead, Morrissey took $2,000 a week out of his gambling house for the next 8 years. Morrissey lost his mother Mary around this time, which encouraged him to want to go back and visit Ireland. So when John Heenan, the now recognised heavyweight champion, was actually due to defend his title against an Englishman called Tom Sayers in Hampshire, John decided to make the journey, not only to watch the fight, but to visit his place of birth in Templemore, County Tipperary, Ireland. He went to visit the house he was born before going on to England to watch the fight, which ended in a very controversial draw. But, Morrissey had to get involved somewhere. So the defining moment came actually in the 37th round when Heenan almost illegally strangled Sayers by forcing his head down over the top rope. Now, amidst the chaos, the ropes were cut and the crowd surged into the fighting area. Because Morrissey was present, he was actually alleged to have been the person to have cut the rope, but he denied those allegations completely. And actually, eyewitnesses apparently confirmed his story. Who knows? I think he probably cut it. On July 15, 1861, while in Albany, Morrissey was actually convicted of breaching the peace. He was fined $50 and sentenced to a term of 3 months hard labour at Albany Penitentiary. That sounds iffy to me. $50 and then sentenced for what? Breaching the peace sounds a bit extreme, considering all the other stuff. Well, that same year, Abraham Lincoln actually became the 16th president of the United States. And John Morrissey, after doing his bit of hard labour, actually met him. He shook his hand and he liked his self-assurance, but he disagreed with his declaration to free slaves. Now, looking for a place away from New York City, John actually went to Saratoga. Now, this is a county in the New York state, and he went there to overlook the building of a racetrack and plan of the gambling casino, which he wanted to open out there as well. Morrissey actually arrived in Saratoga Springs during the Civil War. Pedigree racing was on hold in the war-torn South, so Morrissey, only 32 at the time, thought he could prosper by inventing and presiding over a racing meet at Saratoga.
Taking place only a few weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg, Saratoga's inaugural 4-day meet in August 1863 was held at an old trotting track known today as Horse Haven and was a resounding success. While in Saratoga, he heard the news of the New York draft riots in July 1863. The 3-day-long riots were violent disturbances in Lower Manhattan. Many white working-class men showed their displeasure of the new laws passed by Congress to draft men to fight in the ongoing American Civil War. The riots remain the largest civil and most racially charged urban disturbance in American history. According to Toby Joyce, an engineer with a lifelong interest in the history of 19th century Irish America, the riot represented a civil war inside the Irish Catholic community. He said mostly Irish American rioters confronted police, while soldiers and pro-war politicians were also, to a considerable extent, from the local Irish immigrant community. Just like in the film Gangs of New York, men were taken from the ship they arrived in, placed in American uniform, and then shipped off onto another ship to fight in the Civil War. When John arrived back in New York, he went to his 24th Street establishment and found it boarded up, but it was undamaged. Now, he had lunch there with his elegant friend, Colonel Jardine, who had long been one of the influences in Saratoga. Several hours later, they were trapped in First Avenue between 18th and 19th Streets, where snipers from the rooftops and windows were picking off his men with deadly accuracy. The colonel was wounded in the thigh, and with two other officers he hid in the basement. They were discovered, and Jardine's companions were clubbed to death. He would have suffered a similar fate, but one of the gangster leaders recognised him as a friend of Morrissey's and persuaded the rioters to spare his life.
Yeah, there you go. It's having people in high places, I suppose, isn't it, Morrissey, or in low places. But wow, saved his life. Now, while wheeling and dealing in the gambling houses, Morrissey wanted more. So, with the backing of some prominent sportsmen, he opened the Saratoga racecourse on August the 2nd, 1864. A week later, at the conclusion of the first session of the new track, the New York Times actually reported on this as well. They said it was brilliant as it had been previously at the Saratoga meeting. It culminated in a blaze of glory on Saturday. The grandstand was a superb array of beauty and fashion, the like of which has never previously been seen in America and has only been paralleled at Ascot or Goodwood in England, or on a Royal Cup day. So, I mean, he can do. He's very smart, Morrissey. I mean, he's just produced himself a beautiful racetrack by the sounds of things as well. So, as the Civil War continued for another year, New York began to regain its dignity again. Business improved for Morrissey as gambling houses were more profitable than ever, if it ever could be. His influence in politics increased even more until he was one of the dominant forces of Tammany Hall, which had reached new heights in its thievery and corruption in the years following the war. So Morrissey went to the Democratic Convention in Albany during 1866 as a delegate and played a leading role. But his integrity would be brought into disrepute when a report by the Boston Daily Evening Transcript actually wrote on November the 28th, a few days ago, a man named John Morrissey was charged before the police court in Chicago with being drunk and for abusing his wife, a blind woman, it said. Now, the report went on to say that Morrissey found their description amusing because the assaulted woman they described was not his wife. The miserable looking and badly abused woman was a sister of John Morrissey. A telegraph was sent to John explaining the assault allegation made by his sister, and he replied stating that he had a sister, but he hadn't seen or heard of her for about 17 years. The Boston Daily then wrote that the necessary investigation was made because the poor woman's story was reliable.
Morrissey paid the $250 fine for the assault, effectively confirming his guilt. However, it wasn't as clear-cut as the Chicago Tribune suggested when they wrote that Morrissey may be a bruiser, a burglar, a gambler, and even a Democratic representative, yet possesses some traits which distinguish a man from a demon. Now, that same year in 1866, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle announced that John Morrissey's present wealth was estimated at $1.25 million. That's equivalent to $22 million in today's currency. It was a very wealthy man at this point. Another report was written about his blind sister who had been badly beaten up and almost starved to death by her husband, ironically named John Morris. They were living in squalor in Chicago and were desperately poor with one child. Mr. Morris had beaten his wife once again, but was saved by their 12-year-old son, who stood up to his dad and knocked him to the floor. The boy called for police assistance, and his dad was arrested and sent to jail. It was the Chicago Evening Post that printed an article about the contrast between the brother and his sister's wealth, making the point that John Morrissey was not interested in helping his younger sister. It would seem that her abusive husband forced her to make a false plea against her brother for a quick payout. But Morrissey never tried to get to the bottom of the whole situation. Instead, he just kept away and just paid that $250 fine. He had become more busy with politics than anything else at this point of his life. William M. Boss Tweed was the man in charge of Tammany Hall and was robbing the city treasury blind. For several years, Morrissey had stood side by side with Boss Tweed and assisted him financially in a number of deals. Even though Morrissey objected to his methods, Tweed still named John as a candidate for the United States Congress from the 5th District.
Well, with the full power of the organisation behind Morrissey and his own personal popularity, there was no question of the result. And John Morrissey was elected, becoming the Honourable John Morrissey, hence why there's many books are called Honourable John Morrissey. So John and his wife then moved to Washington for the first session of Congress in which Morrissey was to participate. He understood practical politics, even if his record at Washington was not brilliant, it was acceptable. He returned to New York and received the praises of his compatriots in Tammany Hall. Then in 1868, he stood for re-election, this time in the 7th District, defeating a guy called James M. McMartin and Francis Train. To celebrate his second victory, he commissioned a $75,000 pair of opera glasses covered in diamonds and sapphires from Paris as a gift to his wife. And the Honourable John Morrissey told the United States House of Representatives that I have reached the height of my ambition. I have been a wolf rat, chicken thief, prize fighter, gambler, and member of Congress. Once, when irritated during a debate, he actually threatened someone and he said, if any gentleman on the other side wants his constitution amended, just let him step into the hall with me. So he's offering people that in Congress now. It was not an empty threat either by John, by what some people say. And John Morrissey was enormously popular simply because he was his own man. He didn't bend over for anyone. His early political career hinged on electoral traditions of the day. Each party and faction printed its own ballots. Voters brought a ballot to the polls and dropped it in the box. Now, Morrissey and his contemporaries exploited the voting process in many ways which have been forbidden by the election law today. They were the repeaters who voted more than once, either through multiple registrations or under different names. And Morrissey was a gifted campaigner, said Boss Tweed, said this of Morrissey, as an organiser of repeaters, he had no superior.
The Honourable Timothy D. Big Tim Sullivan once explained the bearded repeater, and he said, when they vote with their whiskers on, you take them to a barber and scrape off the chin fringe. Then you vote them again with sideburns and a moustache. Then off to the barber again, and off comes the sides, and you vote for them a third time, this time just with a moustache. And if that ain't enough, and the box can stand a few more ballots, clean off the moustache and vote for them plain face. This basically made every man good for at least 4 votes by shaving his beard, turning it into a mustard, doing basically changing his disguise in whatever way possible to get these votes. Now, another technique was known as the cannon ballot, and it was named because just a few could blow the opposition sky high. A contemporary of Morrissey wrote this and said, ballots were easy to get, and we took plenty. Each candidate could get all he wanted. Why, kids even played with them. I got huge stacks of the ballots and carried them home to Mary. Mary, put your irons on the fire, I told her. She put 3 or 4 irons on the coal stove, and when they were nice and hot, we went to work on the ballots. We folded the ballots in sets of 10, and then Mary pressed the bundles of 10 until they were thin enough to slip through the slit in the ballot boxes. I distributed these ballots to my workers and they slipped in 10 at a time, while the organisation's men thought they were doing a smart thing by piling in 2 at a time. One of my repeaters went to the polls 20 times and dropped in 10 ballots every time. A poll clerk shook the box before opening it for the count, separating the cannons into individual sheets to prevent detection. I mean, how corrupt is this shit? I mean, this is terrible, absolutely terrible. Like, they're not even just, this is not even just Morrissey doing it. This is basically other politicians saying, yeah, this is how we did it back in, this is how we did things here.
Not only that, they're actually forcing people to vote certain ways as well. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, how was anything ever legit? It never was. Not in New York, and probably not in other states too. But Doc Walloper Dick Butler, what a great name. He actually complained about elections in the early 20th century and compared to his day when he said elections nowadays are sissy affairs. Nobody gets killed anymore, and the ambulances and patrol wagons stay in their garages. There's cheating, of course, but it's done in a polite, refined manner compared to the olden days. I mean, wow. He then went on to explain how the election process worked in the 19th century. And he said in those days, murder and mayhem played a more important part in politics. To be a challenger at the polls, you had to be a nifty boxer or an expert marksman. A candidate, especially if he ran against the machine, was lucky to escape with his life. I was lucky. I only had my skull bashed, my front teeth knocked out, and my nose broken. So Morrissey had so much money at his disposal. I mean, you just mentioned it, Sean, that he actually invested it in the stock market. Now, at first, he was successful, and that was until Friday, September the 24th, 1869, when the market crashed. They called it Black Friday. By the end of the day, John Morrissey discovered that he had lost $800,000. He took the hit very silently, never said a word about it to anyone, and he never, ever invested in the stock market, exchange market again. Luckily, he still had his elegant gambling business on 24th Street in New York, and it was still earning him a large sum of money. Over the next 5 years, the politically established Morrissey became fed up with the blatant stealing from Boss Tweed, which became famously known as the Tweed Ring. Boss Tweed used embezzlement, bribery, kickbacks, taking large chunks of New York's budget and lining his and his associates' pockets. When they began to take $15 million a year, it was going too far for John. So John didn't have a conscience, but he saw bankruptcy for the city and jail for the looters if they continued with their selfish ways.
However, for the time being, Boss Tweed was still too established for anyone to stop until the political situation became more serious. Morrissey and his friends differed with the Tweed group, but nothing could be done within the organisation. Therefore, John, in company with Sheriff Jimmy O'Brien and Prince Hal Gennett, organised the Young Democracy. This was absolute treason to party regulations, but it was the only move they could make. Tammany answered by expelling them in 1870. An investigation of the city government began, and the Sun interviewed Morrissey concerning it, and he didn't hold back, ousting Boss Tweed by publicly announcing that the community knows but little of this man's transactions. Rumour says that he gave $1.8 million of the public money to women friends, money he stole from the city treasury. Morrissey had played a key role in testifying against Tweed and his associates. In 1874, Tweed was found guilty of embezzling millions of dollars, anywhere from $40 million to $200 million from the state and city government contracts to line his pockets and those of his supporters. The evidence that was piled up against him brought him to his death in prison and broke the ring into bankrupt fragments. Tammany Hall panicked and sought to save its dignity by electing Honest John Kelly as the leader. Now, Kelly felt that Morrissey and others who had followed him in the opposition party were needed, so he reinstated them. After the Tweed Rings collapse, Morrissey joined with Samuel Tilden and John Kelly to control Tammany Hall. By 1875, he was serving as police commissioner for which his experience with the criminal justice system qualified him. But Tilden was then governor of New York and running for president, leaving the hall in the hands of Morrissey and Kelly. Their ambitions clashed. Kelly removed Morrissey, who then, having nothing better to do, won election to the state senate from Tweed's old district.
Now, Honest John's followers said that only the district which had elected Tweed would send a vicious thug, a rowdy prizefighter, and a notorious gambler to the state senate. These criticisms annoyed Morrissey because they hurt his wife's feelings, apparently. Accordingly, in 1877, he ran for the state senate from the 7th district, which was the most highly regarded in the city. Rival politicians criticised Morrissey further as a gambler, a prizefighter, a ballot box stuffer, and a burglar. It was also mentioned that when he had been in Congress, he had taken a percentage in Washington's leading illegal card game. All was for nothing because John Morrissey actually won, and he won by a huge majority. When they told him that he had been re-elected, John shouted in delight, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew I would," and looked forward to another term in Albany. It's difficult to assess what type of person John Morrissey had become because apparently he used his connection to avoid further convictions. One was a possible involvement in the murder of a political foe, but details are slim to say the least. They may have been relating to his earlier crimes or they may have been true, we just don't know. He was known as a champion of the Irish Americans while he served in federal government, never forgetting his roots. However, he would also use threats and intimidation to get the decision he wanted. One time he allegedly boasted that he could lick any man in the house. At this point, he had defeated the respectable politicians, but he did not enjoy his triumph for long. Even with the political commitments, Morrissey maintained his majority ownership stake at the Saratoga racetrack and oversaw its continued success, which is now known as the oldest sporting venue in the United States of America.
Saratoga Springs was already a popular vacation destination for New York City's rich and famous, and it became a premier 19th century destination, seeing visitors such as John D. Rockefeller, Mark Twain, and future presidents Chester A. Arthur and Rutherford B. Hayes. Although Morrissey was well liked and very wealthy, he was never fully accepted into the upper ranks of American society. There was still a great anti-Irish sentiment among many, and his status as an immigrant prevented him from being an exclusive among the upper class. He had contracted pneumonia during his last campaign, and was failing to shake it off. The doctors became concerned over John's condition. His infected throat grew worse. Even the most skilled specialist in New York couldn't do anything. They suggested that he go south on the chance that his health might improve away from the damp and the chill of the city. Senator Morrissey and his lady Susie left for Savannah on November the 16th, 1877. After several weeks, they moved further south to Jacksonville, but his health did not improve. He suffered a relapse in February of 1878. His condition became severe, and the doctors expected him to die. His laboured, noisy breathing got worse, but the crisis came, and then it went. He was weak, but told Susie, "We'll go back to New York. It was a mistake to come here. I want to go home." His fever raged, and he became delirious, but he recuperated, then slowly gained back some of his strength. They left for New York on March 27, 1878. A suite had been prepared at the Ashland House. He was tired, but after a day he managed to travel to Troy, and in another week, when the house in Saratoga had been prepared, they moved into familiar surroundings. A month later, on May the 1st, 1878, at the age of 47, the Honourable John Old Smoke Morrissey passed away in his new Saratoga home, with his wife Susie by his side.
Well, the state closed all offices and flags were actually flown at half mast. The entire state senate attended his funeral in Troy, held on May 4th, 1878, and 20,000 mourners, including the lieutenant governor and attorney general, lined the streets to pay their last respects. He was buried in St. Peter's Cemetery just outside Troy, but that's where his story ends. So, what do we make of John Morrissey, Mr. Morrissey, Old Smoke, whatever you want to call him? Well, some historians have attempted to make him a heroic figure of the prize ring and an admirable one in other ways. But the Gazette held a different view, calling him a bold man, a strong and courageous man, also a shrewd one in a bluff and ragged fashion. The Gazette continued to say that luck played him well in his career until his downfall started with the overthrow of the Tweed ring. Luck played an important part in his ring reputation. He was by far the worst punished of the two men when in his fight with Yankee Sullivan was broke up and he was ruled the victor. Tom Hire would almost surely have bested him in a square fight. They were matched once and Morrissey forfeited his appearance money, and after another meeting was agreed upon, the Hires following was so greatly outnumbered by the armed Morrissey gang that the match fell through. When he did fight Heenan, the latter had the misfortune to injure his hand against a ring post. Morrissey declined the subsequent challenge and retired from the ring, thus forfeiting the title to Heenan. Author Kenneth Bridgham, who wrote the book The Life and Crimes of John Morrissey, Bare-Knuckle boxing champion, New York gangster, Irish-American politician, wrote, more than anyone else, John Morrissey personified the links between sports, gambling, high finance, politics, and crime in 19th century America. He then called Morrissey the first true Irish mob boss in American history.
We will come to our thoughts in a minute, but let's just finish on this story with a quote from John Morrissey himself. And he said this to his wife Susie on his deathbed. I came up out of the gutter. When other boys was going to school, I was a bouncer in Alex Hamilton's saloon. They were hard men in that saloon, and the mill, and along the docks. I had to fight my way past all of them. Now I'm rich. Nobody's wife ever had finer clothes or diamonds than you have. The boys that went to school do what I tell them, and they do it quick. How do you suppose I got where I am? By being nice and kind? No, by kicking and stamping and gouging. I can't excuse myself. They would have done the same to me, true enough. But I liked it, Sue. I liked it. And there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That is the story of Old Smoke, John Morrissey, and he's one hell of a character.
Wow.
Indeed. Wow, indeed. That is, it is a one hell of a story, guys, and I hope that, you know, it hasn't been too long-winded for you, and I hope that because of how old this story is, it hasn't been too drab for you in parts. We've really enjoyed this because we hearing the story of a man who lived many, many, many moons ago, even before really boxing came to its true prominence, and we cover the likes of the very early pioneers of this sport. But when you take it all the way back to the Victorian era, which is what it was for the UK at this time, and in America it was so much different. And you know, literally this is a man who's come over with his family as an immigrant into a place where nobody wants to see immigrants. And I mean, there's some parallels to today's life and times with what goes on in certain countries of the world with immigration and the issues it potentially arises. So you can understand and relate to maybe that part of the story in particular. But what you've got here is basically a man who's come from the streets. You know, if you're looking at the real world today and what this is like, you would probably compare this to another rags to riches story, a man who's come from absolutely nothing and made it to the very top of his game. to the very top of the sport, really, at that time. Obviously, the rules were completely different. It wasn't complete prize fighting the way it is today, or even the way it has been in the last 100 years. It was totally different. Anything goes, no rules really, and what rules they were in place were very limited. So, do you consider him to be, a boxing legend, a boxing hero? Probably not, in my opinion, but what I do see in this story is a man who, as he said himself, made it from absolutely nothing, made it all the way to the state senate, a huge political piece of power that he had, and yet years before that he was gouging out people's eyes and biting people's faces and having all these fights and being accused of murder and just, being that rough and ragged man. So am I going to sit here and personify him? Am I going to sit here and make him a hero? Well, no, I'm not. I'm not going to make him a hero, but he's certainly got one hell of a story, a very intriguing story that definitely sits within the narrative of what we cover here on the darker side of boxing. Now, Johnston, I know you really wanted to do this story because it was just so compelling and it was so different to anything that we've ever done. So what did you think overall, now you've done the research and you've done the story and you've kind of got to the end of his life and where things went for him? What do you sort of personify John Morrissey as?
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? It does remind me a little bit of sort of, you think about today, how people sort of talk about the Crays and the Richardsons being from London. You hear guys say that, how good they were. They were arseholes, they were horrible people, but in actual fact, they'd look after you if need be. And the truth of the pudding is they weren't. They were horrible bastards and they weren't very nice at all. And they did some horrendous crimes and deserved to be in prison. And I sort of feel like this way with John Morrissey as well. I think there's a lot more crap that he did that we just couldn't get to the depths of and the bottom of. And it's tricky. You're talking about a time where, we're getting information on conversations literally word for word, and they vary so much. It's different. It's so hard. So you just pick your best one at times and try and produce a story. But he was born in such a horrible situation. If you ever seen Gangs of New York, I mean, I think by the sounds of it, it paints a great picture, and I think it gives you an idea of the image that he lived in. Although they moved the story on to the Civil War, so they move it on when Abraham Lincoln becomes president, which is probably 10 years ahead of, in actual fact, what the Butcher Paul lived in. And I think, he's fought his way to the top, Sean. He's a rough and ready guy. He's a gangster. He is. I mean, you would probably consider him to be a gangster, because the fact is he was strong enough to fight people off and then become a leader, and people followed him. So he effectively become a gangster and a head of the Dead Rabbits at some point. And it was almost inevitable that, these gang fights were always happening, and it was just the way it was. And it was all about being the strongest gang, not too dissimilar to Warriors when you think of America in the 80s, when you had all those different gang cultures over there. It's pretty much the same thing, just in a different time, like 100 years later, 100 years before. So I think he had to do it. I think, he was strong enough, he was big enough, he fought his way to the top. And I think he was horrible to people, but I also think he probably was nice to people as well. And I think the politics thing, he got himself in such a high power because of his strength and to be fair, and his education that he taught himself. You can't help but respect the guy, but I do think that there's some darker elements that we just couldn't get to the bottom of. So I'm not his biggest cheerleader like some people are, but he's a very intriguing character, and he was pretty much the gangster of New York, wasn't he? Let's face it. I think that Bridgham, I think he nails it on the head when he calls in the first true Irish mob boss. I think that's what it was, and it was difficult, wasn't it, Sean, to have to describe this story because we have to dissect the language as well. It's very tricky for us to do that, and that's what took this episode so long for us to do. So we wanted to produce a really good one. Look, end of the day, there are going to be elements that you'll be thinking we're going well away from the story, but I think we paint a great picture of what it was like and how fucking ruthless it was in that time in New York.
It's very important to understand what life was like then to the best of our ability, and I think like you say, it's difficult to really put it into perspective without going too hard on it, because ultimately we're trying to tell the story of an individual who was once an American heavyweight champion, which relates to what we cover, which is boxing. But at the same time, you've got the crimes that were committed, you've got the gangs that he was involved with, the rivalries. It is very much the darker side of boxing and the epitome of what we do on this show, and it is completely different from any other episode that we've ever done for the show. And I think it certainly is one of them episodes, whilst it really will sit well with some of you guys listening to it. Some of you might think, yeah, it was alright, and I kind of prefer more modern things, and that's absolutely fair enough if you have that perception on it, and that's how you've perceived listening to this episode. Ultimately, you know, we want to create content for you guys which is varied and different, and not just all the same things all the time. And this was certainly completely different from what we've done before, and I hope that those that have really consumed it have enjoyed it and have been able to take some really good historical stuff from it. And, you know, you can go and do your own little bits of research. You can go and get the books that are available to read. If anything, it might just go and make you go out and read the books that are available on him and do a bit more of your own sort of understanding of the times. What we've done is we've used all the research available through various literature and tried to present you an overall story and give you sort of a synopsis in a way of what this man's life was all about, and how he's come from nothing to be someone so significant in American history that you guys in America, many of yous, you know, have a lot of respect for him. I'm not saying you all do, because of course you have your different sides with your political parties, and you don't all agree with different modes and methods and the way things were done, like ballot stuffing and things of that nature, and fraud and all the rest of it, of course. But let's be honest, it goes on all the time. So it doesn't really matter what side you sit on there. I think it's just one of them things displaying how corrupt politics kind of is in general. You know, with how I feel personally about it, I just kind of feel that way in general. So it wasn't really any surprise to learn this sort of stuff was going on back then, and probably wouldn't surprise me if it happens in some capacity today, to be honest. But I've definitely enjoyed going through and having a huge history lesson on John Morrissey, and I've really enjoyed hearing the stories and the ruthlessness and the street fights, and, you know, it just sounds so difficult to if you was a normal person living in that area at the time, it must have been horrific to live in, you know, as a person, as an individual, as a family growing up in that. It must have been really terrible and scary to see these gangs just ruthlessly fighting each other on the streets, and no one really being able to stop them as well. And it's a scary time. It really feels like a scary time to have lived in. But as we always say on these shows, if you enjoy them, you know what to do. You can tweet us at darker_side_pod on Twitter, or you can contact us at BTR Boxing Pod on Twitter. And if you want to find us on any other platform, it's BTR Boxing Podcast Network. If you've not subscribed to this podcast feed, you can do it by typing in the darker side of boxing on Google, and you will find us on Apple, on Spotify, on Castbox, on YouTube. If you want to consume it that way, we're available on pretty much every podcasting platform out there, so please do make sure, if you haven't subscribed to it, do it. Now, I'm finally going to say thank you to the patrons of BTR Boxing Podcast Network. Those are the guys that support us additionally to liking and retweeting and sharing. Those guys support us financially, but in return they get ad-free episodes, they get early access to episodes, they get exclusive Patreon-only content. We've got a show called Boxing Through the Decades, where we're literally going through every single decade and talking about all the great fighters, and trying to put our top 10s together to ultimately get a huge list at the end of all of the decades, and try and find that definitive list that we're always searching for. So if you've not heard any of the additional content and you're interested in that, and you want to get ad-free episodes and you want to get early access to all this series-based content, then please visit us at patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast. Well, that is it for this episode. We hope you've enjoyed episode 8 of the 3rd season of The Darker Side of Boxing, and this was the story of Old Smoke, John Morrissey.